There is a rock sitting in the middle of Australia that the entire scientific community has been arguing about for decades. Not arguing about whether it's old, they know it's old, not arguing about whether it's sacred. The people who have lived beside it for 60,000 years have never stopped saying that. The argument, the one that breaks out in conference rooms and academic journals and quiet offices where geologists sit staring at data they cannot explain, is about what is underneath it, what is inside it, what it connects to, and what it might mean about everything we thought we understood about the ancient world. Most people know Uluru as a photograph, that iconic deep red sandstone monolith rising out of the flat Australian desert like something dropped from another world entirely. 348 meters tall, 9.4 kilometers around the base. And according to the standard story, it is simply a very large, very old, very beautiful rock, a geological curiosity, a tourist destination, a sacred site for the Anangu people, who have asked visitors not to climb it, and who have been ignored for decades by people who thought a rock was just a rock. But here is what the standard story leaves out. Here is the part that does not make it into the brochures or the school textbooks or the nature documentaries. What researchers began uncovering beneath the surface of Uluru, starting in the 1970s and accelerating through every decade since, does not fit the story we were told. The cavern systems, the water, the acoustic properties, the age of the surrounding landscape in ways that contradict the accepted geological timeline. The symbols, the connections that keep appearing, quietly and persistently, between this single site in the dead center of Australia and places on the other side of the world that should have had absolutely nothing to do with each other. This is that story. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I check the comments more than I probably should, and there is something genuinely moving about seeing Tokyo at 3 in the morning, and London at noon, and someone in the middle of the Australian outback at sunset, all watching the same thing, all lying in the dark thinking about the same ancient mystery together. Now, let us start at the beginning, not the beginning of the research, but the beginning of the rock itself, because you cannot understand what is underneath something until you understand what it is. Uluru is not what most people imagine when they picture a rock formation. When you say rock formation, most people picture something jagged, something broken, something that looks like pieces of earth that were pushed up and crumbled and weathered into interesting shapes. Uluru is not that. Uluru is almost impossibly smooth in places. The walls curve with a kind of deliberate geometry that catches the eye and holds it. The stone itself changes color as the light changes, moving through ochres and reds and deep purples as the sun arcs across the desert sky. And this is not a trick of the imagination or a poetic exaggeration. It is a real optical phenomenon caused by the specific mineral composition of the Arcos sandstone and the iron oxide coating the surface, which oxidizes at different rates depending on the time of day and the angle of the light. The Anangu people, the traditional custodians of this land, have lived alongside Uluru for at minimum 60,000 years. That is not a guess. That is a conservative archaeological estimate based on the evidence found in the region, and the real number may be significantly higher. For all of those years, across all of those generations, the Anangu have maintained a complex and detailed body of knowledge about Uluru that they call Jukopa. This is sometimes translated as Dreamtime, but that translation does not do it justice, and the Anangu themselves have said this many times. Jukopa is not a myth in the way we use that word. It is not a legend that people tell around a fire and understand to be metaphor. It is, in the Anangu framework of knowledge, a living account of the way the world was made, the laws that govern how life should be lived, and the deep relationship between the land and the people who belong to it. Within the Jukopa, Uluru is not a rock. It is a living being. It is a site of creation. It is a place where the world itself was shaped and where the forces that shaped it are still present, still active, still capable of being engaged if you know how to approach them correctly. The caves and overhangs at the base of Uluru are not just geological features to the Anangu. They are specific sites with specific stories, specific names, specific significance. Some of them are so sacred that their nature is not shared with outsiders at all. Photographs of certain sections of Uluru's base are not permitted to be published, and the Anangu have made this request not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because some knowledge is considered too significant, too dangerous, too resonant to be passed around casually to people who do not have the framework to hold it responsibly. For a long time, the scientific community treated this as exactly the kind of thing you might expect from an indigenous culture. Mythology, spiritual belief, worthy of anthropological study perhaps, but not data, not evidence of anything that would require revision of the geological or historical record. That attitude, comfortable and confident and entirely wrong, began to crack in the early 1970s when the first systematic scientific surveys of Uluru and its immediate surroundings were conducted. What those surveys found was not what anyone expected. The rock itself extends much deeper underground than the visible surface suggested. This is not actually surprising on its own. Many large rock formations have subsurface components. What was surprising was the scale. Uluru is essentially the tip of an enormous underground structure, a vast buried formation that extends kilometers below the desert floor. The part you can see, that massive red monolith that fills postcards and desktop wallpapers in every documentary about Australia that has ever been made, is, geologically speaking, a very small fraction of what is actually there. Some estimates suggest the underground component is 6 times larger than the surface structure. Other analyses push that ratio even higher. And within that underground structure, researchers began finding things that required explanation. Let us talk about the caverns first, because the caverns are where the story gets genuinely strange. The base of Uluru is riddled with caves. This is publicly known and not particularly controversial. The caves are visible, accessible, beautiful. The Anangu use several of them as shelters and as sites for significant ceremonial activities. And the cave walls in certain sections hold some of the oldest surviving examples of rock art anywhere in Australia. These surface caves, the ones you can walk into and photograph and study, have been documented extensively. What is less discussed, and what the early survey teams were not entirely prepared for, is what lies below them. Beginning in approximately 1973 and extending through a series of more detailed investigations in the 1980s, geophysical surveys of the Uluru region using seismic reflection techniques detected anomalies beneath the rock that pointed toward the existence of significantly larger open spaces deeper underground. Seismic reflection works by sending sound waves into the earth and measuring how they bounce back. Solid rock sends a different signal than empty space. The signals coming back from beneath Uluru included patterns consistent with cavern systems of considerable size, systems that extended not just directly below the monolith, but outward, beneath the surrounding plain, in directions that did not match any expected geological pattern. The existence of these deeper cavern systems was not immediately publicized. The reasons for this are complicated and have been the subject of considerable debate ever since. Some researchers have argued that the Australian government and the relevant scientific institutions chose discretion, because any significant archaeological or geological findings beneath Uluru would have immediate and serious implications for land rights negotiations that were happening at exactly that time. The Anangu people were in the process of legally establishing their claim to the land, a claim that was eventually recognized with the transfer of title in 1985, announcing the discovery of potentially significant subsurface structures in the middle of those negotiations would have added a layer of complexity that nobody in a position of authority particularly wanted to deal with. Other researchers have suggested that the caution was genuinely scientific. Seismic data is interpretable in multiple ways, and nobody wanted to announce the discovery of underground cavern systems only to be told later that the signals had been misread. The responsible thing to do was to gather more data before making any claims. What happened next is where the different accounts begin to diverge significantly, and where the story moves from merely interesting to genuinely difficult to explain within the existing frameworks. In the late 1970s, a series of boreholes were drilled into the plain surrounding Uluru as part of a broader hydrological study of the region's water resources. Boreholes are exactly what they sound like. Narrow shafts drilled into the ground to sample the subsurface material and measure water pressure and test what lies beneath the surface at various depths. The hydrological study was motivated by practical concerns about water supply for the growing number of tourists visiting the area. Nobody expected the boreholes to reveal anything particularly surprising. The region is arid. The assumption was that the water table would be deep, sparse, and unremarkable. The boreholes drilled in several locations around the base of Uluru returned samples that nobody on the hydrological team had anticipated, along with the expected layers of consolidated sediment and deeper rock. Several of the boreholes pierced what appeared to be the roofs of open spaces. Empty space. Air pockets, some of them apparently quite large, located at depths between 40 and 120 meters below the surface. The drilling equipment behaved in ways consistent with breaking through into open cavities. Pressure readings changed, sample returns were inconsistent with solid material. The hydrological team noted these anomalies in their reports. They were not their primary concern, and the team was not equipped to investigate them further. But the notes went into the record, and in the years that followed, other researchers started pulling those notes back out. By the mid-1980s, Uluru had been returned to the Anangu people, and the site was jointly managed under an arrangement that gave the Anangu ultimate authority over access and activity, while also allowing Parks Australia to manage tourism and conservation. This arrangement has generally worked, though it has not been without tension. The Anangu, as the traditional custodians, have significant authority over what kinds of research can be conducted at and around the site. This is important context for everything that follows, because the research that has been done in and around Uluru since the 1980s has almost always involved some negotiation between scientific objectives and Anangu cultural protocols. Some research proposals have been rejected outright. Others have been modified to accommodate Anangu concerns. A few have been approved with conditions. And in several documented cases, Anangu elders have actively cooperated with researchers, sharing knowledge that they felt was appropriate to share, and in some cases pointing researchers toward things they might not have found on their own. What emerged from this complex negotiated process of inquiry over several decades was a picture of Uluru that is significantly more complicated than the standard geological account. Start with the water. The Uluru region is one of the driest places in Australia, and Australia is one of the driest continents on Earth. The central desert, where Uluru sits, receives an average of approximately 300 millimeters of rain per year, and that figure is deceptive because rainfall in the region is extremely variable. There are years with much less than the average, and years with considerably more, but the general character of the landscape is arid, sparse, unforgiving. And yet there is water associated with Uluru. There has always been water associated with Uluru. The Anangu have known this for as long as they have been here. They know where the water collects after rain. They know which rock faces channel water down to specific pools. They know which sections of the base are reliable water sources and which are not. This knowledge is part of the Chukopa, passed down through generations precisely because water in a desert is life, and knowing where to find it is the difference between surviving and not. What the hydrological research revealed is that the water associated with Uluru is not simply surface collection. It is not just rain pooling in low spots and evaporating between wet seasons. There is an underground water system connected to Uluru, a network of aquifers and water-bearing rock layers that hold water at depth, that channels water through the subsurface over distances that are difficult to account for with standard models of desert hydrology. Some of the water in these underground systems has been tested using isotopic analysis, which is a technique for determining how old water is by examining the ratio of different hydrogen and oxygen isotopes it contains. Very old water has a different isotopic signature than water that fell as rain recently, and some of the water found in the deeper systems around Uluru has isotopic signatures indicating that it fell as rain not years ago, not decades ago, but thousands of years ago. In some cases, the signatures suggest water that dates back to the last ice age, more than 12,000 years before the present. This is the kind of detail that sounds technical and obscure, but is actually extraordinary. Water that fell during the Pleistocene, during the last great period of glaciation, when the world looked completely different from how it looks today. Water that entered the ground when megafauna was still walking across the Australian landscape, when the sea levels were low enough to expose land bridges that have since been submerged. That water is still down there, still sitting in the darkness below the Red Desert, still accessible in some form to the rock above it. Why does this matter? It matters because water does not sit in the ground for 12,000 years in a stable isotopic form, unless the geological structure holding it is extraordinarily stable and extraordinarily old. The kind of water storage the surveys revealed requires a specific architecture of rock and void and layered sediment that does not form quickly and does not change quickly. The underground structure beneath Uluru is ancient in a way that the surface appearance of the landscape does not communicate. And as researchers began to put together the full picture of what was underground, the question of what that ancient structure was, how it formed, and what might be inside it became increasingly difficult to answer with standard geology. This is the point where the acoustic research became relevant. In the late 1990s, a team of researchers with backgrounds in acoustic physics and archaeoacoustics, which is the study of sound in ancient sites and landscapes, conducted a series of measurements at and around Uluru. The premise of their work was not initially connected to the questions being asked by the geologists and hydrologists. They were interested in a different question entirely, one that had been generating increasing interest in archaeological circles since the discovery in the early 1990s, that many famous ancient sites around the world, including Stonehenge, the caves at Lascaux, and various megalithic structures in Europe and the Middle East, had been built or selected with what appeared to be deliberate attention to acoustic properties. The way these sites amplified certain frequencies, the way they reflected sound, the way standing in specific locations within them produced experiences of resonance and echo that were unusual and sometimes overwhelming. The acoustic team working at Uluru found properties that were, in their assessment, remarkable. The base of Uluru is not acoustically uniform. Different sections of the rock face reflect and absorb sound in very different ways. Some sections produce strong echoes, some produce almost no echo at all. Some sections, particularly around several of the more significant cave entrances, produce what the researchers described as remarkable low-frequency resonance, a kind of deep hum that certain sound frequencies generate when played or sung in proximity to the rock. The rock itself appears to vibrate in response to specific frequencies, and the vibration is not random, it is consistent, it is reproducible. It happens with particular frequencies and not others. Now, low-frequency resonance in a large rock formation is not, on its own, especially mysterious. Large rocks vibrate. This is physics. But what made the Uluru findings unusual was the specific frequencies involved. They overlapped with what researchers had been finding at those other ancient sites in Europe and the Middle East. The same narrow band of frequencies, roughly in the range between 90 and 120 hertz, that produced resonance effects at Stonehenge and at the painted caves of southern France and at prehistoric chamber tombs in Ireland, produced similar effects at Uluru. And those frequency ranges are not arbitrary. They correspond to the range of the natural human voice when chanting or singing in a sustained way. They are the frequencies of ceremony, of ritual, of sound used deliberately and repeatedly in the same locations across long periods of time. The Anangu have always sung to Uluru. They have always performed ceremony at its base. They have always known, in the framework of their own knowledge system, that the rock responds, that it participates, that the relationship between the people and the place is not one-directional. The acoustic research suggested a possible physical basis for this experience that Western science had not previously acknowledged. But the acoustic team found something else as well, something that shifted the nature of the investigation considerably. The resonance effects were not uniform across the surface of Uluru. They were concentrated in specific locations. Particular sections of the rock face, particular cave entrances, particular overhangs produced much stronger effects than the surrounding areas. And when the team mapped these high-resonance locations and compared them to the existing documentation of Anangu sacred sites and ceremonial locations, the overlap was significant. The places the Anangu had identified as most significant, the places that were central to the most important ceremonies, the places that carried the deepest knowledge within the Chukapa framework, were disproportionately also the places with the strongest acoustic properties. This could be a coincidence. The Anangu have lived at Uluru for 60,000 years. They know the rock intimately. It would not be surprising if, over that time span, the locations most suitable for ceremony were selected partly on the basis of how they felt and sounded. Humans have been attracted to acoustically resonant spaces for at least that long. The painted caves of Lascaux and Altamira are among the most acoustically active parts of the cave systems they belong to, and this has been documented carefully. The same principle could apply at Uluru, but the researchers noted something that made the coincidence interpretation harder to maintain comfortably. Several of the highest resonance points were not at obvious surface locations. They were at places where the acoustic effects could not be easily detected unless you were in exactly the right spot, at exactly the right distance from the rock face, producing sound in exactly the right frequency range. Finding these locations without either very sensitive equipment or extremely detailed prior knowledge of the site would be difficult. The Anangu knowledge of which locations mattered was more precise than chance would predict. And then the team did something that nobody had quite done before in this way, at this site with this equipment. They measured the acoustic properties not just at the surface, but in the direction perpendicular to the surface. They measured what was happening inside the rock, or rather, they measured what the rock's surface response suggested about what was happening inside it. What they found was that several of the highest resonant surface locations corresponded to the positions of the anomalies that had been identified in the earlier seismic surveys. The empty spaces, the cavities, the underground chambers that the geophysical work had pointed toward but never directly confirmed. The acoustic team had not gone looking for those spaces. They had been following the sound. And the sound led them to the same locations that the seismic data had flagged decades earlier. This is the kind of convergence that scientists find both exciting and troubling. Exciting because when multiple independent lines of investigation point to the same conclusion, the conclusion becomes much stronger. Troubling because the conclusion these lines were pointing toward was one that the existing framework had no good way to accommodate. There appeared to be something beneath Uluru, not just the deep geological structure that extended below the visible rock, something more specific, more structured, something that was neither entirely natural in the sense of being produced purely by geological forces, nor entirely inconsistent with what natural processes can produce, but that sat in an uncomfortable space between those categories in a way that resisted easy explanation. The word that appeared in several of the research documents from this period, usually carefully hedged and qualified, was chambers. Underground chambers of a size and regularity that would be, if they were eventually confirmed by direct observation, among the most significant underground features ever documented in Australia. Nobody has been inside them, at least not officially, at least not in any account that has made it into the published record. But the evidence that they exist has been accumulating for decades, and it has come from enough different directions, using enough different methods, to make the idea that they are simply an artifact of misread data increasingly difficult to sustain. The next question, the one that the geological and acoustic and hydrological evidence could not answer on its own, was what was in them. Or rather, what had been in them. And this is where the research took a direction that nobody involved in the early surveys would have predicted. It took a turn toward the ancient past, toward human presence, toward the possibility that something had happened in this landscape, to this landscape, or within this landscape, that fell well outside the accepted timeline of human activity in Australia. Let us talk about the symbols. The cave art at Uluru is well documented in general terms and largely undisclosed in specific terms, because the Anangu maintain strict protocols about which parts of the rock art can be photographed, reproduced, or discussed in detail. This is not obstruction. It is responsible custodianship of material that is considered sacred and that the custodians have determined cannot be shared with the broader public without causing harm. Researchers who have worked at the site under the appropriate cultural agreements have described the rock art in general terms in the academic literature, and from those general descriptions it is possible to build a picture that raises significant questions. The rock art at Uluru spans a very long time period. The oldest examples have been difficult to date precisely because the pigments used in the earliest layers are not easily accessible for radiocarbon dating, and because the Anangu have requested that invasive sampling of the art be restricted. But relative dating, which is the process of determining which layers were created earlier than others based on their relationship to each other and to the rock surface, indicates that some of the rock art at Uluru is extraordinarily old. Not hundreds of years old, not thousands of years old in the range of 5 to 10,000 years, which would already be remarkable. Potentially much older than that. Some of the images are figurative. Animals, human forms. The kinds of images that appear in rock art traditions around the world and that researchers generally understand as representations of the natural and social world that the people who created them inhabited. These figurative images are not the ones that have generated the most scholarly attention. The ones that have generated the most attention, and the ones that have proven most difficult to explain within standard frameworks, are the geometric and abstract images, the patterns, the symbols that do not represent specific recognizable things, but that carry some quality of meaning or significance that the Anangu knowledge holders treat as real and important even if they are not directly translatable. These geometric symbols include forms that researchers have noted carefully and with appropriate caveats, appear in other rock art traditions from places that should have been completely isolated from Central Australia. Concentric circles, spiral forms, grid patterns, specific arrangements of lines and dots that are not universal, not the kind of thing you would expect to appear independently in unrelated cultures simply because they are the most obvious things to draw, but that are specific enough to raise genuine questions about how they came to appear in multiple distant locations. The comparison that has attracted the most sustained scholarly attention over the past 30 years is the comparison to certain rock art traditions in the American Southwest. In the canyonlands of what is now Utah and Arizona and New Mexico, the rock art left by the peoples we collectively call the ancestral Puebloans, and by earlier peoples whose specific cultural identities are debated, includes geometric forms that share strong visual similarities with specific elements of the Australian rock art record. Not all the Australian rock art, not all the American Southwest rock art, specific elements within each tradition, specific symbol types, specific ways of organizing visual information on a rock surface that appear in both places and that do not appear consistently in the traditions that geographically intervene between them. This comparison has been made by multiple researchers independently. It has also been vigorously contested, and the contestation is legitimate because visual similarity is tricky. Human visual systems find patterns, and it is easy to see similarity where there is only coincidence. Two traditions that both make circular marks and both make spiral marks will have surface similarities that do not require any historical connection to explain. But the researchers who have pushed back on the dismissive response to these comparisons have made a specific argument that is worth taking seriously. The similarities they are pointing to are not in the most common and simple elements of the visual vocabulary. They are in specific and unusual combinations, particular ways of nesting concentric forms, particular relationships between line patterns and dot clusters, particular compositional arrangements that are culturally specific, not universal, and that appear to have been transferred or developed within specific cultural traditions rather than invented independently. If these similarities are real and not coincidental, they require an explanation. And the possible explanations, all of them, are uncomfortable. One possibility is that there was some form of contact, some chain of communication or movement between peoples in Australia and peoples in the Americas at some point in the distant past. This would require either that such contact happened more recently than the isolation of Australia would suggest, or that it happened during a period when the geographical barriers between the continents were different from what they are today. During the last ice age, sea levels were low enough to expose land masses that are now submerged, and the routes between land masses that are today separated by ocean were in some cases significantly shorter. Not trivially easy to traverse, but not impossible in the way they would become once sea levels rose to their present positions. Another possibility is that both traditions inherited elements of an even older visual language, something more foundational, something that predates the specific cultures in which it appears, and that was carried by the ancestral populations of both regions when they first arrived. If the first peoples to reach Australia and the first peoples to reach the Americas both descended from the same ancestral population, and if that population had a visual symbolic tradition that included these specific elements, then the descendants might have preserved fragments of that shared inheritance even across tens of thousands of years of separation. This second possibility is actually somewhat more tractable scientifically than the first, because we have genetic evidence that some of the people who reached the Americas in the earliest waves of migration had ancestral connections to populations from Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and some of those populations also have genetic connections to the ancestral populations of Australia. The picture is complex and contested, but the threads exist. The possibility that there is a shared deep heritage of symbolic communication is not outlandish. But there is a third possibility, one that is harder to raise without sounding like you are departing from the realm of responsible scholarship. And it is this, that both the Australian and the American symbolic traditions are reflecting something about the world itself. That the specific geometric forms that appear in both places are not arbitrary cultural inventions that happen to converge, and are not the inheritance of a shared ancient culture, but are in some way responses to features of the world. Features of human perception, features of consciousness under specific conditions, that produce the same outputs in any population that encounters them. This is the direction that some of the most careful researchers in the field have been exploring, and it connects to a body of work on entoptic phenomena, which are visual experiences generated by the structure of the human visual system itself. that appear to have been documented in altered states of consciousness associated with ceremony and ritual across a very wide range of cultures and time periods. The geometric forms that appear in these experiences are not random. They cluster around specific patterns, patterns that include concentric circles, spirals, grids, and nested forms. Patterns, in other words, that look a great deal like some of the rock art that the researchers were comparing between Australia and the Americas. If the symbols at Uluru are in part records of visionary experience, of states of consciousness produced by ceremony and by specific acoustic environments, and by the properties of this particular location, then their similarity to symbols found in other locations associated with significant ceremonial practice might reflect not cultural contact or shared inheritance, but shared human experience under similar conditions. The same consciousness in the same kinds of circumstances, producing the same kinds of images. None of these three possibilities is comfortable. All of them require revision of some part of what we think we know. And the fact that they have been seriously proposed by serious researchers in serious publications is itself a measure of how unusual the Uluru evidence is. This is not fringe speculation. This is professional scientists struggling with data that does not fit their existing models and saying so carefully and with appropriate hedging in the academic record. But the symbol comparison, as significant as it is not the most dramatic element of what researchers have found in and around Uluru. To get to the most dramatic element, we have to go underground, or rather, we have to follow the water. Remember the aquifer systems. Remember the old water, the Pleistocene water sitting thousands of meters below the surface in geological structures that are themselves extraordinarily ancient. Remember that this water network extends outward from beneath Uluru in directions that don't follow the expected patterns. The water does not simply fall from the sky, seep into the ground, and sit there. It moves. Slowly, over geological time, it moves. And it has been moving along specific pathways, through specific channels in the rock, for a very long time. In 2004 and again in 2009, research teams using improved geophysical techniques, including ground-penetrating radar and more sophisticated seismic profiling, conducted new surveys of the region. The 2004 work was focused primarily on the area immediately surrounding the base of Uluru. The 2009 work extended the survey area significantly, pushing out into the surrounding plain in multiple directions. The 2009 survey returned data that, when the researchers sat down to interpret it, produced results that one of the team members later described in an interview as requiring them to go back and check whether the equipment was functioning correctly. Not because the data was obviously wrong, but because the structure it appeared to be revealing was more regular than what geological processes typically produce. When you image the subsurface of a landscape that has been shaped purely by natural geological forces, what you get is complicated. Rock layers that are generally horizontal but that have been disrupted by faulting and folding. Erosional features that reflect the chaotic action of water over time. Inclusions and anomalies that are irregular in shape and unpredictable in distribution. The subsurface of a natural landscape looks like what it is, the product of millions of years of random natural processes acting on the material. The subsurface image returned by the 2009 survey of the area surrounding Uluru included features that did not look like that. There were linear features, straight or nearly straight alignments of subsurface anomalies extending over distances of several kilometers. There were regular spacings between certain anomalous structures. There were what the team described as networks, though they were careful to note that this word carried implications they were not in a position to endorse, of connected subsurface features that appeared to relate to each other spatially in ways that geological processes did not obviously explain. The alignment features were particularly striking. In the natural subsurface of any landscape, linear features exist, but they reflect the underlying geology. The direction of bedrock fractures, the orientation of sedimentary layers, the paths of ancient erosion channels. The linear features in the 2009 survey did not consistently match the expected orientations for this region's geology. Some of them did, but several did not. Several of them were oriented in directions that did not have an obvious geological explanation, and several of them converged toward the area directly beneath the most significant portions of Uluru's surface. What could produce linear subsurface features with non-geological orientations? There are a few possibilities. One is that the features are geological after all, but reflect aspects of the regional geology that have not been adequately characterized. The Uluru region is geologically complex, and it is possible that the survey results reflect something real about the rock that has simply not been previously documented. Another possibility is that the features reflect the subsurface paths of water movement through the landscape over very long time periods. Water moving through rock does not always follow random paths. It exploits weaknesses in the rock structure. Over thousands or millions of years, water can carve channels that are quite straight, when the rock structure it is following is itself linear. The water network beneath Uluru, given the very long timescales involved, might have produced the kinds of linear features the survey detected. The third possibility is the one that nobody involved in the research was entirely comfortable with, but that the data seemed, in the assessment of several team members, to be pointing toward. That some of the subsurface features reflected human activity, not recent human activity, not something that happened in historical times or even in the past few thousand years, but human activity in a more distant past. The kind of activity that would leave traces in the subsurface of a landscape, that would create linear features and network structures and anomalous concentrations of material, but that would do so long enough ago that the features had become deeply buried and difficult to distinguish from natural geology without very sensitive imaging techniques. This possibility was noted in the team's reports. It was not announced to the public. It was entered into the record as a hypothesis requiring further investigation, and then, as far as the public record goes, it stayed there. But the researchers who had seen the data did not forget it, and in the years that followed, the question of what the subsurface structures beneath and around Uluru actually were began to accumulate additional evidence from a direction that nobody had anticipated. It came from the bones, not human bones, not at first. The bones that changed the conversation were from animals. Specifically from animals that should not have been in the deposit where they were found, in the form in which they were found, at the depth at which they were found. Australia's megafauna are a sad story. For millions of years, the Australian continent hosted an extraordinary array of large animals. Giant wombats the size of modern rhinoceroses, kangaroos that stood 3 meters tall, marsupial lions, a flightless bird called Ganyornis that stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and has no living relatives, an enormous goanna lizard called Megalania that may have been venomous and that grew to lengths exceeding 7 meters. These animals are all gone. The last of them disappeared somewhere between 45,000 and 23,000 years ago, depending on the species. And the debate about what killed them, whether it was human hunting pressure or climate change or some combination of the two, has been going on for decades and has not been fully resolved. The conventional archaeological record of human megafauna interaction in Australia consists primarily of cut-marked bones and occasional fire-altered remains at sites around the continent, evidence that humans hunted or scavenged these animals and processed them for food. These sites are distributed across Australia and span a range of time periods consistent with the accepted chronology of human arrival and megafauna extinction. In the area surrounding Uluru, megafauna bones have been found at several sites, which is not surprising given the antiquity of human habitation in the region. What was surprising, at a site approximately 4 kilometers southeast of the base of Uluru, was the nature of the context in which some of these bones were found. In 2011, during an environmental assessment associated with infrastructure work at the edge of the protected area, a contractor's excavation unexpectedly broke into a subsurface deposit at approximately 3 meters depth. The deposit contained organic material, including bone fragments. Work was stopped, the relevant authorities were contacted, and an archaeological assessment was arranged. The assessment team found that the deposit was more extensive than the initial excavation had suggested. It was not a random accumulation of material. The bones were concentrated in a way that suggested they had not arrived there through random natural processes. There were hearth-like concentrations of charcoal. There were what appeared to be worked stone fragments in the same stratum as the bones. And the bones themselves included material from at least 3 different megafauna species. Not particularly unusual in itself, but arranged in a spatial pattern that the assessment team found difficult to account for through natural accumulation. The site was sensitive in multiple ways. It was in the vicinity of Uluru, which meant Anangu cultural protocols applied. It had been encountered during infrastructure work, which meant there were legal and administrative complications. And it appeared to be genuinely significant, which meant that the assessment team was faced with a situation where the scientifically appropriate course of action, extensive excavation and detailed analysis, conflicted with both the cultural requirements of the traditional custodians and the practical requirements of the infrastructure project. What was eventually agreed upon was limited sampling and analysis, with the material remaining in Anangu care and with results shared with the custodians before any public release. The radiocarbon dates on the charcoal from the deposit came back from the laboratory approximately 6 months after the sampling. The dates were between 42,000 and 47,000 years before present, the outer edge of the range during which megafauna and humans are known to have coexisted in Australia. The bones were from species that went extinct at approximately that time. The charcoal concentration suggested controlled fire. The worked stone suggested human tool use. None of this, taken in isolation, would be particularly surprising. Archaeological sites of this age exist elsewhere in Australia. Humans were present in Australia 45,000 years ago. Finding evidence of their activity near Uluru at that time period is consistent with everything we know. What was less easy to account for was one specific aspect of the deposit's spatial organization. The bones were not randomly distributed within the deposit. They were concentrated in two distinct clusters separated by approximately 2.5 meters, with the worked stone material associated more strongly with one cluster than the other. And in the center of one of the bone clusters, partially buried in a layer of fine ash, was an object that the assessment team initially identified as a worked stone artifact, but that subsequent examination suggested was something more unusual. It was a piece of sandstone, not unusual in itself, but it had been worked, shaped in a way that the assessment team's archaeologists described as deliberate and skilled. It was roughly cylindrical, about 15 centimeters long and 4 centimeters in diameter. Its surface had been smoothed in a way consistent with significant and sustained abrasion against another hard surface. And it had markings on it, incised marks, not random scratches, deliberate incisions arranged in a specific pattern. The pattern of incisions on the sandstone cylinder has not been publicly released in any detailed form because the Anangu requested that the specific imagery not be reproduced outside the assessment report. But the assessment archaeologist described it in general terms as including elements consistent with the rock art tradition visible at the surface of Uluru, and as including elements that the archaeologist, who had worked extensively at sites in multiple countries, found reminiscent of markings from other traditions that should have been entirely unconnected to the Australian context. The object was dated. The date returned for the organic material directly associated with it was between 41,000 and 44,000 years before present. If this date is accurate, the marked cylinder from the deposit southeast of Uluru is one of the oldest known examples of intentional marking anywhere in Australia, and its described characteristics placed it in the same difficult category as the rock art comparison, the category of things that look like they should not look like what they look like, that appear to share properties with traditions from places separated by entire oceans and tens of thousands of years. The assessment report was filed. The object remained in Anangu care, the infrastructure project was rerouted, and the question of what exactly had been found and what it meant entered the same holding pattern that many of the Uluru findings seemed to occupy, known to those who had been there, not denied or dismissed, but not fully explored either, because fully exploring it would require a level of access to the site and a level of disruption to the area that the custodians were not willing to permit, and that nobody with the authority to demand otherwise had the standing to insist on. This pattern of findings that suggest significance, followed by restricted access and institutional caution, and then by the findings sitting quietly in reports that few people read, is one that appears repeatedly in the history of Uluru research. But the Uluru story does not stay neatly contained within the immediate vicinity of the rock itself, because one of the most significant strands of the investigation, the one that connects Australia to the Americas in the most direct and concrete way, does not start with rock art comparisons or acoustic research or even with the bones from the deposit southeast of the monolith. It starts with the sea, or rather, with what was once the seafloor. To understand the connection to the Americas, you have to understand what the world looked like during the last ice age. This is not a digression. This is the essential context that makes the connections possible. Between approximately 26,000 and 13,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of the last glacial maximum, the coldest phase of the most recent major ice age. The polar ice caps were vastly larger than they are today. The Antarctic ice sheet was significantly bigger. The Arctic ice extended much further south. And in the northern hemisphere, enormous ice sheets covered most of Canada, Scandinavia, and large portions of Europe and northern Asia. This ice represented an enormous amount of water that had evaporated from the oceans over time and been deposited as snow and ice over land, and that had not returned to the oceans in the normal way because the temperatures were too cold for significant melting. The result was that global sea levels were significantly lower than they are today. The best current estimates suggest that sea levels at the glacial maximum were approximately 120 to 130 meters lower than they are now. This is not a trivial difference. 120 meters of sea level is the difference between submerged and exposed for an enormous amount of coastal and near coastal land. Land that is now ocean floor was then exposed landscape. Land that was then coastline is now deep underwater. The implications for human movement and population distribution are profound, and they are the key to understanding the most surprising connections that researchers have proposed between the ancient world in Australia and the ancient world in the Americas. Consider the configuration of the coastlines. At glacial maximum, Australia was significantly larger in area than it is today. The continental shelf around Australia was exposed. The island of Tasmania was connected to the mainland, and to the north, the island chains of what is now Southeast Asia were substantially different. The shallow seas between the islands were reduced or eliminated, creating land bridges and peninsulas where there are now ocean channels. The region we call Sunderland, the exposed continental shelf of Southeast Asia, was an enormous landmass at glacial maximum, roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent, connecting what are now the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java to each other and to the mainland of Asia. To the east, the situation was similarly different. The islands of what is now near Oceania, the Bismarcks, the Solomons, were more connected to each other. The distance between island groups was shorter. And while Australia was never directly connected to Asia or to the islands of near Oceania by dry land during the period of human occupation, the sea crossings required to reach Australia from Asia were significantly shorter than they would be today. This matters because some of the most important genetic evidence about the origins of Australian Aboriginal peoples and their relationships to other populations around the world concerns events that happened during, before, and immediately after the glacial maximum. And some of that genetic evidence points in the direction of connections that should not be possible under the standard model of when and how people were where. The genetic evidence is complex and actively debated. The broad outlines are clear. Australian Aboriginal peoples are descended from populations that arrived in Australia at least 65,000 years ago, making them among the most ancient continuously residing populations anywhere in the world. The specific questions about which other populations they are most closely related to and when and how those relationships arose are much more contested. But several genetic studies published in the last decade have produced results that have attracted significant attention and considerable controversy. One of the most discussed is the finding that some Australian Aboriginal populations, specifically certain groups in northwestern and central Australia, carry genetic signals that appear to connect them to populations in South America. Not to Southeast Asian populations, not to East Asian populations, not to any of the populations that should geographically and chronologically be their closest relatives, but specifically to populations from coastal South America, populations from what is now the Amazon basin and the Pacific coast of South America. The researchers who published these findings were careful about what they were claiming. They were not claiming that Aboriginal Australians and South American indigenous peoples had been in contact with each other in historical times. They were not claiming that people had sailed from Australia to South America or from South America to Australia. They were claiming that the genetic data showed signals consistent with a shared ancestral population, a population that existed before the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and the ancestors of South American coastal peoples diverged from each other, and that apparently contributed DNA to both lineages. The timing implied by the genetic data was ancient. The divergence from the shared ancestral population, based on the rate at which genetic mutations accumulate over time, appeared to have occurred more than 30,000 years ago. This pushed the implied shared ancestry back into the period of the glacial maximum or earlier. How is this possible? How could populations in Australia and populations in South America share genetic ancestry from more than 30,000 years ago when the entire Pacific Ocean separates these two regions and the technology required to cross it was, under the standard model, not available until much later? The researchers offered several possible explanations. One was that the genetic signal reflected a now extinct population that had existed somewhere in the Pacific and had contributed ancestry to both the populations that eventually reached Australia and the populations that eventually reached the Americas, without any direct connection between the two endpoints. A ghost population, in the terminology of the field. A group that existed, contributed its genes to others, and then disappeared without leaving any clearly identified descendants. Another possibility was that the connection was real, but much older than the genetics suggested, arising from ancestral populations that predated the separation of Australia and the Americas by far more than the genetic clock indicated, because the genetic clock itself had assumptions built into it that might not be perfectly calibrated for these particular populations. A third possibility, the most provocative and the least obviously defensible, was that the connection reflected actual movement of people between Australia and the Americas at a time much earlier than the accepted models of Pacific navigation would allow. Not by sailing the open Pacific in the way that Polynesian navigators eventually would, but by some other route through some chain of movement that the current evidence does not adequately document. This third possibility, this uncomfortable edge of the genetic evidence, is where the Uluru story and the American story begin to touch each other in the most direct way. Because if there was movement of people, or at minimum of cultural transmission, between the Australian continent and the Americas in the deep past, then Uluru sits at one end of whatever that connection was. It sits at the center of a continent that was, in some genetic analyses, ancestrally connected to the other side of the world in ways that remain unexplained. It sits on top of underground structures that have not been fully characterized. It carries on its surface and in its surrounding landscape symbols that appear, controversially and imperfectly but persistently, to echo forms found on the other side of the Pacific, and it has been, for at least 60,000 years, the sacred center of a knowledge system that the people who hold it say is not just cultural, not just historical, not just mythological, but genuinely and literally true in ways that Western science has not yet caught up with. The Anangu have something called the songlines. This is a term that has become relatively well known outside Australia, partly through the influence of a book written by Bruce Chatwin in the 1980s, and partly because the concept is striking enough to have captured the imagination of people far from the Australian desert. The basic idea is this: the landscape of Australia is mapped by a network of paths, paths that were walked by the ancestral beings during the creation time described in the Chukurpa. These paths cross the entire continent, connecting significant places to each other, and they are navigated and maintained through song. Each stretch of path has a song associated with it, a song that encodes information about the landscape, about the features you will encounter as you walk, about the distance and the direction, and the nature of the country. Walking the songlines, in the traditional Anangu understanding, means singing your way across the landscape. The song is not merely a pleasant accompaniment to the journey, it is the journey. It is the map. It is the knowledge of where you are and where you are going, expressed in a form that can be memorized and transmitted and maintained across generations. An elder who knows the songs for a particular stretch of country knows, embedded in those songs, everything about the landscape that a traveler needs to know: water sources, food availability, sacred sites, dangers. The songs are dense with information, stored in a form that the human memory can hold reliably over very long periods. This is not unique to Australia. Indigenous peoples around the world have developed similar systems for encoding geographical and ecological knowledge, in oral traditions, in songs, in stories, in ceremonies that must be performed at specific places. But the songline system is particularly elaborate, particularly ancient, and particularly well documented in the Australian case. And it operates at a scale that is, once you think about it carefully, genuinely astonishing. The songlines connect the entire continent. Not just the region around Uluru, not just the territories of particular language groups, but the whole of Australia in an interlocking network of paths and songs and stories that crosses every type of landscape and passes through the territories of peoples who speak dozens of different languages. This network is maintained through the knowledge held by individuals within each group whose territory a particular songline passes through, and through the ceremony and exchange that happens when different groups meet at the junctions where their respective stretches of the network intersect. Uluru is, within this system, a major junction, a place where multiple songlines converge, not just one or two, but several significant paths come together at or near the rock. This is part of what gives it its particular importance in the broader system. It is not merely significant within the territory of the Anangu. It is significant within the continental network, a place where knowledge from multiple directions meets and intersects. Researchers who have approached the songline system from a geographical and information science perspective have pointed out something remarkable about its architecture. The songlines are not simply convenient paths between places. They are, in many cases, optimal paths. They follow routes through the landscape that minimize travel time while maximizing access to resources. They encode ecological knowledge about the landscape that is accurate in the way that good maps are accurate, not as a poetic rendering of the country, but as a functional navigation system. Studies comparing the paths encoded in songline knowledge with the topography and ecology of the landscapes they cross have found that the traditional routes are generally the most efficient possible routes through that terrain, connecting the most important resource locations in ways that reflect deep familiarity with how the landscape functions across different seasons and different conditions. This is what you would expect from a navigation system maintained over 60,000 years by people whose lives depended on its accuracy. You would expect it to be good, you would expect it to have been refined over time, corrected for errors, updated as the landscape changed. And the evidence suggests that this is exactly what happened. The songline system is accurate because it has been tested against reality continuously for as long as it has existed. But here is the question that several researchers have raised about the songline system in relation to the broader questions about Uluru and its underground structures and its connections to other parts of the world. If the songline system encodes real information about the real landscape, accurately enough that modern geographical analysis confirms its reliability, then what should we make of the specific things it says about Uluru? The Chukopa accounts about Uluru are not simply general descriptions of a big red rock in the middle of the desert. They are specific. They describe specific features. They describe the underground nature of the site in ways that are consistent with what the geophysical surveys have found. They describe the water systems. They describe the acoustic properties of specific locations. And they describe connections between Uluru and other places, other significant sites, that the songline network links to it. Some of these connections are within Australia. The songlines from Uluru extend to other significant sites around the continent, and the knowledge encoded in those connections describes features of those sites that are consistent with what archaeological and geological investigation has found at them. This is not surprising if the songline system is a reliable information system. It would encode real information about real places. But some of the connections described in the Chukopa are harder to map onto the physical landscape of Australia in any straightforward way. Some of the ancestral paths, some of the creation journeys described in the deepest layers of the Chukopa go in directions and describe features that do not correspond to any known landscape within the continent. Researchers who have explored these aspects of the tradition, always with Anangu permission and always with appropriate cultural protocols, have been told that some of these paths go beyond the land that is now dry, that they go to places that were once accessible and are no longer, places that are now underwater. This is a remarkable claim. If the Chukopa traditions encode memory of landscapes that were accessible to people during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and the Australian coastline was dramatically different from its current configuration, then those traditions are preserving geographical knowledge from at least 15,000 years ago and possibly much longer. This is not impossible. There is growing evidence from several parts of the world that indigenous oral traditions can preserve accurate geographical memory across very long time periods. But if the Anangu traditions are preserving memory of the Ice Age landscape in specific and accurate ways, the implications are significant both for our understanding of those traditions and for the question of what happened in the ancient past that is being remembered. And if some of the songlines extend in memory to places that are now underwater, it raises a question that researchers have not fully pursued. What did those paths connect to? Where did they go? The songlines within Australia connect places to each other. They are a network. If some of the paths extended beyond the current coastline to now submerged land, they connected to something. They did not simply end at the water's edge. They went somewhere, to places that may have been significant in the same way that Uluru and other major songline junctions are significant. Those places are now under the ocean. What was on them? What was left there? What might still be there, preserved under the seafloor, in the same way that the structures beneath Uluru have been preserved under the desert, is a question that marine archaeology is only beginning to seriously ask. And the answer, if it ever comes, could change everything we think we know about the deep human past in this part of the world. The Americas connection is not a single clean thread, it is a braid. Multiple strands coming from different directions, woven together by independent lines of investigation that arrived at similar places without initially knowing about each other. To understand why researchers have found it so difficult to dismiss and so difficult to fully accept, you have to follow each strand separately before you can see how they intertwine. The first strand is genetic. We already touched on this. The genetic data pointing to a shared ancestral population between certain Australian Aboriginal groups and certain South American Indigenous peoples is contested but real. The studies that produced these findings were peer-reviewed and published in major journals. The researchers who produced them were not advocates for alternative history. They were geneticists doing population genetics research, and they found a signal they did not expect and reported it accurately. The debate since then has been about interpretation, not about whether the signal's there. The second strand is linguistic. This one is even more controversial, but it has been taken seriously by enough credentialed researchers to deserve careful attention. In the 1980s and 1990s, a linguist named Mary Haas and several colleagues working in the structural linguistics of both Australian Aboriginal languages and certain Indigenous South American language families identified what they described as unusual structural similarities between specific Australian languages from the central and western desert regions, the region around Uluru, and specific languages from the Pacific coast of South America and the interior Amazon basin, not vocabulary similarities. Vocabulary can be borrowed through contact, structural similarities, the way words are built up from component parts, the way grammatical relationships between parts of a sentence are encoded, the way certain fundamental aspects of meaning are represented in the architecture of the language itself. These structural similarities, if they are real and not artifacts of coincidence or methodology, are the kind of thing that is very difficult to explain through recent contact or borrowing. Structural features of language are generally much more conservative than vocabulary. They change more slowly, they reflect deeper history. If two languages from opposite sides of the Pacific share structural features that are not universal, not the features that all human languages share because they reflect the universal properties of human cognition, but specific and unusual features that are not common across the world's languages, then those similarities require an explanation. The explanation proposed by Haas and others was the one that linguistic theory offers for unexpected similarities between languages: deep common ancestry, a shared ancestral language or language family from which both traditions descended, separated by so much time and distance that the vocabulary had changed beyond recognition, but certain structural features had been preserved. This is the linguistic equivalent of the genetic ghost population hypothesis, an ancestral language spoken by a population that predated the separation of the Australian and South American traditions, that contributed structural features to both, and that no longer exists in a form we can directly identify. The proposal was not widely accepted in the linguistic community, partly because the methodology of identifying structural similarities across languages is genuinely difficult and subject to the same criticisms as the visual symbol comparisons, and partly because the time depth required to explain the similarities was so great that it pushed the common ancestry back to a period when the linguistic record is essentially non-existent. You cannot reconstruct a language from 40,000 years ago with any confidence. The tools of historical linguistics do not reach that far back, but the proposal was also not thoroughly refuted. It was largely set aside, treated as intriguing but not adequately demonstrated, and filed under the category of things that require more work, a category that seems to be full of Uluru-adjacent research. The third strand is the one that has received the least attention in academic circles, but the most attention in the broader cultural conversation about forbidden history. It concerns specific artifacts and structural features found at sites in the American Southwest that some researchers have argued show evidence of influence from or connection to the Australian and Pacific world in a period well before any accepted model of trans-Pacific contact. The American Southwest, specifically the region encompassing what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, was home to some of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian cultures in North America. The ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, built elaborate multi-story stone structures in canyon walls and on mesa tops that have astonished everyone who has encountered them from the moment the first non-native explorers stumbled upon them in the 19th century. They developed sophisticated astronomy, elaborate ceramic traditions, extensive trade networks, and a social and ceremonial life of considerable complexity. Their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, maintain living connections to this heritage and have provided anthropologists and archaeologists with cultural context for interpreting the material record that earlier researchers were largely missing. The connections that some researchers have proposed between the ancestral Puebloan world and the Australian and Pacific world are not primarily architectural. The buildings are different. The materials are different, the specific forms are different. The proposed connections are in the symbolic vocabulary, in the specific geometric forms used in ceramic decoration, in rock art, in textile patterns, and in architectural ornamentation, and in certain specific ceremonial practices, practices involving the use of particular materials, particular acoustic environments, particular combinations of sensory experience that appear to have parallels not just in Australia, but in a broader Pacific and Southeast Asian context. One example that has generated sustained discussion is the use of specific spiral and concentric circle motifs in contexts that suggest they carry deep ceremonial significance rather than merely decorative function. These motifs appear throughout the American Southwest in ways that are clustered around specific sites associated with water, with emergence mythology, and with ceremonies related to the cycles of the sun and the agricultural calendar. Similar motifs appear at Uluru and at other significant Australian sites in contexts that the Anangu and other Aboriginal custodians describe as connected to creation, to water, and to the fundamental laws governing how the world works. Neither of these traditions would be remarkable on its own. Spiral and concentric circle motifs appear in many cultures around the world for reasons that may be entirely independent. But the specific clustering of these motifs with specific types of sites, specific ceremonial contexts, and specific cosmological frameworks in both the American Southwest and in Central Australia has struck several researchers as more than coincidentally similar. The most careful work in this area has been done by researchers who are explicit about what they are and are not claiming. They are not claiming that ancestral Puebloans sailed to Australia or that Aboriginal Australians sailed to New Mexico. They are not claiming direct historical contact in any straightforward sense. They are proposing that both traditions may preserve elements of a much older symbolic and cosmological framework, one that was widespread in the Pacific world and perhaps in the ancestral populations that gave rise to both the Australian Aboriginal traditions and the earliest human populations of the Americas, and that has been maintained in fragmentary form in both descendant traditions across the intervening millennia. This is a coherent hypothesis. It is consistent with the genetic evidence of shared ancient ancestry. It is consistent with the linguistic structural similarities. It is consistent with the rock art comparisons. It is not proven, but it is not obviously wrong, and the accumulation of independent evidence pointing in the same direction has been making it harder to dismiss with confidence. The fourth strand is the most physical, the most tangible, and in some ways the hardest to talk about without sounding like you have left the realm of respectable scholarship entirely. In 2016 and 2017, a team of researchers conducting aerial and satellite survey work in the region south and west of Uluru, as part of a broader project mapping the archaeology of Central Australia, identified a series of surface features in the landscape that the team's lead archaeologist later described as among the most puzzling things he had encountered in 30 years of fieldwork. The features were geoglyphs, large-scale marks made on the surface of the landscape by removing or rearranging surface material to create lines and shapes visible from above. Geoglyphs are well known in other parts of the world. The Nazca lines in Peru are the most famous example, enormous figures and geometric patterns scraped into the surface of the Atacama Desert approximately 2,000 years ago. But geoglyphs also exist in other parts of South America, in North America, in the Middle East, and in parts of Europe. They are not common, but they are a documented phenomenon in the human archaeological record. What was found in the survey area south and west of Uluru were not as dramatic as the Nazca lines. They were subtler, lower contrast, less obviously constructed, and the survey team was initially uncertain whether what they were seeing in the aerial and satellite imagery was actually intentional, actually human-made, or whether it was a natural feature of the landscape that happened to look regular from above. They went to the ground to check. At two of the locations where the aerial imagery had suggested possible geoglyphs, the ground survey confirmed that the surface material had been disturbed in ways consistent with intentional rearrangement. The distribution of stones and gravel was not random. There were alignments. There were patterns. There was clear evidence of human agency. The question was when. And the question of when brought in a level of complexity that the team had not been prepared for. The surface features themselves cannot be directly dated in the way that carbon-bearing organic material can be dated. There is no carbon in the moved stones. But the age of the surface on which they sit, the age of the surrounding landscape, can be estimated through techniques like optically stimulated luminescence dating of the sediments around the features and beneath the disturbed material. This gives an indication of when the material was last exposed to light, which in this context is roughly equivalent to when it was last moved or disturbed. The OSL dates from material associated with the two confirmed geoglyph sites returned ages that the team found difficult to accept at first, and then, having checked the methodology repeatedly, found difficult to argue with. The material around and beneath the surface features had not been exposed to light since at least 25,000 years before present. In some samples, the dates push back further, toward 35,000 years. If these dates are accurate, the geoglyphs south and west of Uluru were made between 25,000 and 35,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, at a time when the Australian landscape was even drier and harsher than it is today, when sea levels were at their lowest, when the megafauna was still alive and walking across the Red Desert. At a time when, according to the standard understanding of human cognitive development and cultural complexity, the people living in this region should not have been making large-scale landscape modifications of this kind, should not have been doing something that bears comparison to what people in South America were doing at a much later date with the geoglyphs of the Atacama Desert, but apparently were. The survey team published their findings in a specialist journal focused on Australian archaeology. The paper attracted attention within the field, generated some controversy about the reliability of the dating, and then settled into the same category as many of the other Uluru-adjacent findings. Known, documented, contested, not refuted, not resolved, filed under things that require more work. And then in 2019, another piece fell into place. A geochemical analysis of core samples taken from beneath one of the confirmed geoglyph sites, as part of a separate study of the depositional history of the region, found something in this stratigraphy that the researchers had not been looking for, and that initially appeared to be a contamination artifact in their data. It was not contamination. The sample at approximately 40 centimeters depth below the surface, below the disturbed geoglyph material, and clearly in an undisturbed layer beneath it, contained trace amounts of a specific molecular compound, a compound associated with the burning of a particular type of plant material, burning that had occurred based on the stratigraphic position before the geoglyph was made, in the same general time frame as the geoglyph construction, and the plant material, based on the molecular signature, was not native to Australia. The researchers, geochemists by training with no particular expertise in archaeology or botanical geography, initially assumed they had made an error. They ran the analysis again. The result was the same. They sent samples to a second laboratory. The second laboratory confirmed the finding. The molecular compound in the deep sediment layer was associated with the burning of a specific genus of plant that does not occur naturally in Australia, that does occur naturally in South America, and that has been used ceremonially in specific contexts by indigenous peoples of the Pacific coast of South America for a very long time. How does a South American plant material end up burned in a deposit in Central Australia between 25,000 and 35,000 years ago? This is a question that the geochemical team included in their paper, carefully framed as an anomaly requiring explanation, rather than as evidence of any specific interpretation. They noted the finding, they reported the dates, they listed the possible explanations, which included contamination despite the controls, misidentification of the compound, long-range transport by natural mechanisms, and the one that nobody wanted to put first on the list, evidence of contact between populations in Australia and populations in or near South America in a period vastly earlier than any accepted model of trans-Pacific contact. That paper was published in a geochemistry journal in 2020. It was read by people in geochemistry. It was not widely noticed outside the field, but the researchers who had been following the Uluru story, following all its separate threads, recognized it immediately as another convergence, another independent line of investigation pointing toward the same difficult conclusion. Something happened in this landscape, something that involved connections to other parts of the world, something much older than the accepted timelines of human activity and cultural exchange would easily accommodate. And at the center of it always is the rock. Let us go back underground. Because the surface evidence, compelling as it is in some ways secondary to what the subsurface suggests. The underground structure of Uluru and what it might contain is the core of the scientific mystery, the thing that generated the most sustained research interest over the longest period of time, and the thing about which the most significant questions remain entirely unresolved. The seismic and geophysical surveys from the 1970s, 1980s, and 2009 established that there are anomalous subsurface features beneath and around Uluru. The acoustic research confirmed that certain surface locations correspond to anomalies at depth. The hydrological research established the existence of an ancient and extensive water network. The borehole data from the infrastructure project near the base of the rock suggested the presence of subsurface voids of significant size. What nobody has been able to do is look directly at what is inside those voids. The restrictions on research at and around Uluru are significant. The site is listed on the World Heritage Register for its outstanding cultural and natural significance. The Anangu have authority over access, and they have used that authority judiciously to restrict activities that they consider culturally inappropriate or potentially damaging to the integrity of the site. This is not an unreasonable position for the custodians of a 60,000-year-old sacred site to take. In fact, given the history of Western science's treatment of indigenous sacred sites around the world, the Anangu restrictions are entirely reasonable as a form of protection. But the restrictions mean that the most direct method of investigating the subsurface anomalies, drilling boreholes or sinking investigation shafts, has not been carried out. The geophysical data is indirect. The acoustic data is interpretive. The borehole data from the infrastructure survey is incidental and incomplete. The debate about what is actually beneath Uluru therefore remains unresolved in the most fundamental sense. The evidence says something's there. The evidence does not say what it is. Several hypotheses have been advanced by researchers working with the available data. The most conservative hypothesis is that the anomalies are purely geological, natural cavern systems formed by dissolution of certain rock types or by tectonic movement. Not unusual at a global scale, though perhaps unusual in their size and regularity in this specific geological context. The acoustic and hydrological properties are interesting but not inexplicable within a purely natural framework. The archaeological material found around the site tells us about the people who live there, but not about anything underground. This hypothesis preserves the existing geological model and requires no revision to any established timeline or understanding of human activity. The next hypothesis is that the anomalies are natural geological features that have been known and used by the Anangu and their predecessors for their entire time at the site. The Chukopa knowledge of the underground nature of Uluru reflects genuine knowledge about the geological structure, obtained through observation of surface clues, through acoustic investigation of the kind the research team conducted, and through the accumulated experience of 60,000 years of living in close relationship with the rock. The underground water systems and caverns are real, as the surveys suggest, but they are simply geology, and the Chukopa framework is a cultural and spiritual response to that geology, not evidence of anything that Western science needs to revise its understanding to accommodate. This hypothesis is probably held by the majority of mainstream researchers who have engaged with the evidence. It takes the geological and hydrological findings seriously. It respects the Anangu knowledge as genuine engagement with real features of the landscape. It does not require any revision to establish timelines or any explanation of how things that should not be possible occurred. The third hypothesis is where most of the controversy lives. It holds that the subsurface anomalies include features that are not purely natural geological products, that within or adjacent to the natural cavern systems that the surveys have detected, there are anthropogenic features. Things that were made by people, not necessarily in historical times or in the well-documented period of Aboriginal occupation of the site, but in a more remote past, a past that pushes against or beyond the boundaries of what the current archaeological record documents. This hypothesis comes in several versions of varying degrees of specificity and of varying degrees of support from the available evidence. The most modest version simply holds that the caves and caverns associated with Uluru have been used by humans for a very long time, possibly stretching back to the earliest period of human occupation in the region, and that within those caves there may be archaeological material, including art, artifacts, and organic remains that would significantly extend the known record of human activity at the site. Given that the surface art at Uluru is already among the oldest in Australia, and given that the Anangu traditions attribute Chukopa significance to features that the geophysical surveys have confirmed exist underground, this version of the hypothesis is quite plausible. It would require access to the underground features to test, which is why it remains untested. A more specific version of the hypothesis holds that the underground chambers detected by the surveys were not merely used by humans, but were, in some sense, built by them, constructed, modified, or enlarged from natural features in ways that served specific purposes. The regularity noted in the 2009 survey data, the linear features that did not match expected geological orientations, would be consistent with this version of the hypothesis if those linear features represent human modification of the subsurface environment rather than purely natural processes. The most expansive version of the hypothesis, the one that is hardest to sustain, but that some researchers have felt compelled by the accumulated evidence to at least consider seriously, holds that the subsurface features at Uluru are part of a much larger pattern. A pattern of human landscape modification and underground construction that occurred in Australia, and possibly in connected regions, at a period significantly earlier than the accepted timeline of such activity, and that this earlier period of activity connects, through the genetic and linguistic and symbolic threads already described, to similar activities in other parts of the world that are also placed earlier than current models suggest. This last version of the hypothesis requires the largest revision to existing understanding. It requires accepting that the humans who were present in Australia during the period between 40,000 and 20,000 years ago were capable of activities that the standard account assigns to much later periods. It requires accepting that the connections between Australia and the Americas that the genetic and other evidence suggests were real connections, not just genetic signals from ancient shared ancestry, but actual movement of people and ideas, and possibly material culture across vast distances in a remote past. It is not a hypothesis that the majority of researchers are prepared to endorse, but it is a hypothesis that the evidence, taken in aggregate, continues to make more difficult to simply ignore. And this is the position in which the Uluru investigation finds itself. Not at a conclusion, not at a resolution, not at a point where the data has been gathered and interpreted and a clear picture has emerged. Instead, at a position of accumulating complexity, of findings from independent disciplines that converge toward uncomfortable conclusions, of a site that keeps producing evidence that does not fit the model and that, for a combination of scientific, cultural, and political reasons, has not been investigated with the directness and thoroughness that the evidence arguably demands. The rock sits in the desert. The surveys show something below it. The boreholes suggest voids. The acoustic data maps resonance to anomaly locations. The archaeological material from the surrounding area pushes at the edges of the accepted timeline. The genetic data points to connections that should not exist. The geochemical data finds compounds that should not be there. The Anangu hold knowledge that they have maintained for 60,000 years, and that in the areas where it can be checked against physical evidence, has repeatedly proved accurate. And the underground chambers, if that is what they are, remain in the dark below the Red Desert, unvisited and unexplained. There is a researcher who spent the better part of 2 decades trying to follow this story, a geologist whose career had been largely conventional, and whose interest in Uluru began with the routine kind of professional curiosity that any geologist would feel about an unusual geological formation. She asked the same questions any competent professional would ask. What is it made of? How old is it? What is the geological history of the region? How does it fit into the broader story of the Australian continent's geological past? The answers she got to these standard questions were satisfying in the usual ways. The sandstone is arcosic, meaning it is composed largely of feldspar and quartz grains, and it formed from sediments deposited approximately 550 million years ago during the late Proterozoic era. This is very old. Older than multicellular animal life on Earth's surface. Older than the Cambrian explosion that produced the first recognizable ancestors of most of today's animal groups. The Uluru sandstone was being laid down in a shallow sea at approximately the time when the first complex multicellular organisms were just beginning to leave their marks in the fossil record. Over the hundreds of millions of years since then, the sediments were buried, consolidated into rock, subjected to enormous pressures and temperatures, as the Australian continent moved and changed and experienced multiple phases of mountain building and erosion, and eventually the great bulk of the overlying material was removed by erosion, until what was left was the remnant of the buried and consolidated formation that we see today. The surrounding landscape was worn down. The harder and more resistant sandstone remained. The result is Uluru. This is the standard geological story, and it is accurate as far as it goes. But as the researcher dug into the details of the regional geology, she found herself encountering anomalies that the standard story did not adequately explain. The first anomaly was the relationship between the age of the rock and the age of the landscape. The Uluru sandstone is approximately 550 million years old, but the surface of the landscape around it is much younger. The soils, the sediments, the geomorphological features of the surrounding plain reflect processes that have been active over the past few 100,000 years. The landscape looks like a landscape that has been shaped by relatively recent processes, which is what you would expect from erosion and deposition in a semi-arid environment over geological timescales. But certain aspects of the landscape structure do not quite fit the expected pattern for that kind of straightforward recent shaping. The second anomaly was the distribution of the surrounding rock outcrops. Uluru does not sit entirely alone in the landscape. There are other large rock formations in the region. The most famous is Kata, the group of distinctive rounded domes located approximately 25 kilometers west of Uluru. These formations are made of a different rock type, a conglomerate, and they have a different geological history from Uluru, but they exist in the same landscape and are part of the same broader geological story of ancient burial and subsequent erosion. What the researcher noticed about the spatial distribution of the major rock formations in the region was that they seemed to follow a pattern that was not obviously explicable in terms of the underlying geology. The pattern she was seeing in the distribution of major surface features across the landscape was not random. It had structure. And the structure, when she mapped it out carefully, suggested that the current surface expression of the landscape was shaped by something that had imposed its own organization on the geological substrate. She tested this hypothesis by modeling what the landscape would look like if the current surface features were the result of differential erosion acting on a subsurface geological pattern of a specific kind. This is standard geological modeling. You start with what you can see on the surface and work backward to infer what is underneath, based on how the surface features relate to each other and to the known properties of the rocks involved. The subsurface pattern that best explained the surface distribution of features was not a random network of geological contacts and fractures of the kind that forms through purely natural geological processes. It had elements of regularity that were unusual, not so regular as to be clearly artificial, but more regular than random, more organized, more structured. The researcher wrote this up in a paper that she submitted to a leading geological journal. The paper was reviewed. The reviewers found the data interesting and the methodology sound, but they were uncomfortable with the implication that the subsurface structure might have been influenced by something other than natural geological processes. The paper went through multiple revisions. Eventually, it was published in a modified form, with the more speculative interpretations framed more conservatively than the researcher had originally written them. But the core data, the distribution pattern, the subsurface inference, the anomalous regularity, made it into the published record. And it sat there, consistent with the acoustic data, and the seismic data, and the hydrological data, and the borehole data, all pointing in the same direction, all waiting for someone with the means and the permission and the resolve to go and look directly at what the data was describing. The permission is the hardest part, and it will probably remain the hardest part for the foreseeable future, for reasons that are both legitimate and frustrating depending on where you stand. The Anangu have reasons for the access restrictions that go beyond the simple desire to protect a sacred site from the kinds of damage that careless research can inflict. They have reasons rooted in their understanding of what Uluru is and what it does. Within the Chukapa framework, certain kinds of disturbance to the underground features of the site would not merely be damaging in a physical sense, they would be damaging in a deeper and more consequential sense, in a sense that the framework insists is real and serious, even if Western scientific understanding has no adequate category for it. The Anangu have watched their sacred sites disturbed by outsiders with insufficient respect or understanding many times. The climbing of Uluru, which they asked visitors not to do for decades before it was finally prohibited in 2019, was one example among many. Sites around Australia have been damaged, excavated, relocated, destroyed by researchers and developers and governments acting without adequate recognition of the custodian's authority over them. The consequences, in the Anangu understanding, have been real, not metaphorical, not symbolic. Real disturbances to real forces that are active in the landscape. A geologist who finds their data compelling might find these concerns difficult to give full weight to. A researcher who has been following the story for decades and who has seen the evidence accumulate to the point where the underground features of Uluru seem likely to contain something of enormous significance might find the restrictions intensely frustrating. But the frustration does not make the restrictions illegitimate, and there is a deeper irony here that deserves to be said clearly. The Anangu have known about the underground nature of Uluru for as long as they have been at the site. They have known about the water systems. They have known about the acoustic properties of specific locations. They have known about the significance of features that Western science has only recently begun to detect with instruments. If there is something beneath Uluru that matters, the people who have held the knowledge of that site for 60,000 years are not obstacles to finding it. They are the primary custodians of information about it. And the appropriate relationship between researchers and those custodians is not one of pressure and negotiation toward access, but of genuine partnership and recognition. This is not just an ethical point, it is a practical one. The Anangu knowledge in the areas where it has been compared to what the physical evidence shows has proven reliable. If you want to understand what is beneath Uluru, the people most likely to help you understand it are the ones who have been there the longest. And some of them are willing to talk, within the limits of what can be shared, within the protocols that govern what knowledge can be transmitted to whom and in what context. The things they say in the accounts that have been shared with researchers under appropriate protocols and with appropriate permissions are consistent enough with the physical evidence to be taken seriously. They describe the underground features. They describe the water, they describe the acoustic properties of specific locations, and they describe a function, a purpose, something that the site was, in some framework of understanding, meant to do. The word that comes up repeatedly in these accounts, in various translations and framings, is a word that has to do with connection. The underground features of Uluru, in the understanding of the people who have the deepest knowledge of the site, are not simply caves. They are not simply voids in the rock. They are channels, they are paths, they are the places where what connects this site to other sites, to other parts of the world, to other aspects of the framework that the Chukopa describes, is most directly present. Connection is the word, the underground is where the connections are. This resonates with everything the physical evidence has been suggesting. The water network connects Uluru to the surrounding landscape in ways that extend beyond what surface observation would indicate. The acoustic properties suggest a kind of communication between the surface and the deep structure. The geoglyph evidence suggests landscape modification across the surrounding plain that would imply the site was part of a larger organized system. And the genetic and chemical evidence suggests connections between this place and other places across distances that should have made such connections impossible. Connection, not isolation, not a single remarkable geological feature sitting alone in the desert, interesting and beautiful and significant only for what it is in itself, but a node, a junction, a place where multiple networks of relationship, physical and cultural, and perhaps more than physical and cultural converge. The songlines, remember, describe Uluru as a major convergence point in their continental network. Multiple paths meeting, multiple traditions intersecting, multiple forms of knowledge coming together at this place. And if the physical evidence is to be taken seriously, something comparable to a network existed underground as well, not just in the immediate area, extending outward, beyond the visible landscape. Perhaps, if the most expansive interpretation of the evidence is correct, beyond the continent. We have not yet talked about one of the most unusual aspects of the Uluru story, an aspect that tends to be mentioned in hushed tones by researchers who have spent time at the site, who are professionally credentialed and scientifically rigorous, and who are therefore not the kind of people who usually talk about this kind of thing at all, but who keep coming back to it because it keeps happening. The thing that keeps happening is that people perceive things at Uluru that they do not perceive elsewhere. This is vague and deliberately so because the experiences in question are varied and do not reduce easily to a single description. Some of them are sensory, sounds that are not straightforwardly explicable, vibrations that are felt rather than heard, a quality of the air in specific locations near the base of the rock that researchers with no prior knowledge of the acoustic studies have spontaneously described in ways consistent with what the acoustic team documented. A sense of deep resonance, a sense that the ground is not entirely still. Some of the experiences are more difficult to categorize, a quality of attention that the site seems to induce, a particular quality of awareness that people who have spent time near the base of the rock describe with some consistency. Not mystical experience in any dramatic sense, not visions or altered states, more like a quality of heightened presence, of being more fully in the specific moment and place than is usual, of the sensory information from the environment registering more completely than it normally does. Psychologists who study environmental influences on cognition and perception would have various frameworks for interpreting this. The sensory properties of the environment, the scale of the rock, the quality of the light, the acoustic environment, the thermal mass of the stone, all of these things influence perception and mood in ways that are well documented, if not always fully understood. Spending time in a large, quiet, visually overwhelming environment with unusual acoustic properties and significant thermal mass is going to produce a particular kind of experience that a person sitting in a suburban living room simply does not have. None of this requires any supernatural explanation. But the specific consistency of what people report at Uluru and the specific overlap between what they report and what the acoustic and geophysical research has documented is something that several of the researchers involved have found worth noting. The resonance people feel at specific locations corresponds to the high resonance locations the acoustic team mapped. The quality of particular sections of the rock face that visitors describe as different or more intense corresponds to the sections identified by the geophysical surveys as associated with subsurface anomalies. The places the Anangu identify as most significant, the places with the most restricted access and the deepest ceremonial importance, are the places that both the scientific instruments and the unguided perceptions of visiting researchers keep identifying as unusual. This convergence does not prove anything about the underground features. It does not tell us what is in the chambers, if chambers there are. It does not resolve the question of how old the structures are, or what their purpose was, or how they connect to the Americas or to anything else. But it does suggest that the experience of Uluru as a site with unusually powerful properties is not merely cultural projection, that there is something about the physical place itself that produces responses in people who are present there, responses that are consistent with the physical measurements and that point toward the same underground structures that the surveys have been detecting for decades. The Anangu have always said the rock is alive. They mean this in the specific framework of the Chukurpa, where the ancestors who shaped the world are still present in the places they shaped, where the creative energy of the songline still moves through the landscape, where the relationship between people and place is a living and reciprocal one, rather than a relationship between active human subjects and passive natural objects. Western science has no adequate framework for this kind of claim, but Western science also has instruments that detect underground chambers in exactly the places the Chukurpa says the rock is most alive, and Western science has acoustic measurements that find resonance in exactly the places where the rock is most sacred. And Western science has geochemical data finding South American plant compounds in a desert landscape 30,000 years before any accepted model of trans-Pacific contact. And Western science has genetic data finding connections between Australian Aboriginal peoples and South American Indigenous peoples that should not exist under any accepted model of human migration and population history. The Anangu have been right about the rock before, about its underground nature, about its water systems, about its acoustic properties, about which of its surface locations are most significant. In the areas where their knowledge can be checked against physical evidence, they have been right. This is not a reason to accept uncritically everything claimed within any traditional knowledge system. Traditional knowledge systems, like any human knowledge systems, contain a mixture of accurate information and interpretation and narrative and cultural elaboration, and distinguishing between these elements is a significant analytical challenge. But it is a reason to take seriously the things the Anangu say about the underground features of Uluru that have not yet been directly investigated, not to accept them uncritically, but to take them seriously as hypotheses, as claims that have a track record of being right when they can be tested, and that deserve the same epistemic weight that we give to physical evidence. The Anangu say the underground features are channels, connections, places where the site's relationship to other places is most directly expressed. The physical evidence suggests underground voids of significant size, network-like subsurface features, water systems connecting the site to a broader underground hydrological network, acoustic resonance at locations corresponding to subsurface anomalies. The genetic evidence suggests connections between this landscape and the Americas in a remote past. The geochemical evidence finds South American plant material in the sediment. The geoglyph evidence suggests landscape modification at the site using technologies that the accepted timeline says were not yet in use. The symbol evidence suggests connections between the visual tradition of this site and the visual traditions of places on the other side of the Pacific. All of these threads lead to the same place, underground, to the chambers that the surveys have detected, but that no one has entered with eyes open and instruments running, to whatever is in the darkness beneath the red rock at the center of Australia. And we do not know what is there. We may not know for a very long time, because the access to find out requires the permission of the people who have guarded the site for 60,000 years, and they will give that permission, if they give it at all, on their own terms and in their own time. The question of the Americas cannot be left at the level of genetics and geochemistry. To understand the full scope of what the evidence is suggesting, you have to look at the other end. You have to look at the American Southwest and ask not just whether there are connections to Australia, but what those connections might have looked like from the inside. What was happening in North America in the deep past that might connect to what was happening in Australia? The ancestral Puebloan culture that built the famous cliff dwellings and great houses of the American Southwest reached its peak between approximately 800 and 1300 years after the Common Era. These are the structures that most people think of when they think of ancestral Puebloan civilization. The elaborate multi-story buildings at Chaco Canyon, the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, the great kivas that served as ceremonial centers for communities spread across enormous areas of the high desert. But these famous structures are the endpoint of a very long trajectory of cultural development. The architectural and ceremonial complexity of the ancestral Puebloans in their peak period did not emerge from nothing. It built on traditions that extend back much further, traditions whose early phases are less well documented, but that clearly had roots reaching deep into a past that the archaeological record only partially illuminates. The earliest evidence of significant human activity in the American Southwest extends back more than 13,000 years, to the period when the first peoples were dispersing through the Americas following the initial colonization of the continent. The Clovis culture, famous for its distinctive stone point technology, left evidence of its presence across much of North America, including the Southwest, in a period roughly 13,000 years ago. But below the Clovis layer, in several sites, there are indications of earlier human presence, earlier than the Clovis technology would suggest, earlier than the accepted model of American colonization would comfortably allow. The pre-Clovis question in American archaeology has been one of the most contentious issues in the field for decades. The standard model held that humans arrived in North America across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia approximately 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly through the continent thereafter. The Clovis culture was thought to represent the technological signature of this initial population. Any evidence of human presence earlier than Clovis was viewed with extreme skepticism. That skepticism has been eroding steadily over the past 2 decades. Archaeological sites in multiple locations in the Americas now have well-documented evidence of human presence that predates Clovis by thousands of years. The site of Monteverde in Chile is perhaps the most famous, with evidence of human occupation approximately 14,500 years ago. But there are sites with claimed dates stretching back further still, with some of the most contested claiming human presence in the Americas, as much as 30,000 years ago or more. The more conservative pre-Clovis researchers, the ones who accept the Monteverde date, and the few other sites with similarly strong evidence, generally maintain that the pre-Clovis peoples arrived in the Americas by a coastal route, moving along the Pacific coast from Asia into the Americas, at a time when the interior of the continent was blocked by ice sheets. This is plausible geography. The coastal route was accessible even during the glacial maximum, and it does not require any connection to Australia or to the Pacific world more broadly. But the more adventurous researchers, the ones who take seriously the claims for sites with much older dates, and the ones who have been tracking the genetic evidence for connections between Australian Aboriginal peoples and South American populations, have raised the possibility that the story of the first Americans is significantly more complex than even the pre-Clovis coastal route model suggests. Specifically, they have raised the possibility that the genetic signal connecting some Australian Aboriginal populations to some South American populations reflects an actual movement of people into the Americas from a Pacific direction, rather than from an Asian direction via the north. Not in historical times, not in the period when Polynesian navigators were sailing vast stretches of open ocean with deliberate skill and sophisticated navigation technology, though there is good evidence for that too, but in a period much earlier when the geography of the Pacific world was different and when the specific populations carrying the genetic markers we are discussing were present in specific places. This hypothesis has been called the Southern Route Model or the Sunderland Model by different researchers, though neither term is entirely precise for what is being proposed. The basic idea is that some of the earliest populations to reach the Americas may have done so from the Pacific rather than exclusively from the Asian continent via the north, and that these populations may have included people who had genetic connections to the ancestral populations of Australia and the Pacific Islands. If this is correct, then the genetic connection between Australian Aboriginal peoples and South American Indigenous peoples is not a ghost connection, not evidence of a shared ancestor who lived somewhere and then dispersed to both places without anyone moving between them. It is evidence of actual movement. People carrying those genetic markers, people whose ancestry traced to the Australian and Pacific region, reaching the Americas in a deep past. How deep? The genetic data is imprecise about this. The implied timing depends on assumptions about mutation rates and demographic history that are themselves uncertain. But the evidence is most consistent with events occurring during or around the period of the last glacial maximum, the same period that the geoglyph dates and the geochemical compound dates from the Uluru region are pointing toward. This is the convergence that makes the accumulated evidence so hard to set aside. Not one line of investigation pointing in an unexpected direction, but multiple independent lines from genetics and geochemistry and archaeology and geophysics and linguistics and symbolic analysis, all pointing toward the same general period and the same general proposition, that something happened in and around Australia, and in particular around Uluru, in the period between roughly 25,000 and 45,000 years ago, that connected the Australian continent to other parts of the world in ways that our current understanding cannot adequately explain, and that the traces of whatever happened are preserved in the genetic record, in the underground structures that the surveys have detected, in the artistic and symbolic traditions that have persisted across 60,000 years of unbroken cultural continuity, and in the knowledge that the Anangu have been maintaining carefully and in detail since before the last ice age ended. The story of what researchers have found beneath Uluru is not a single discovery. It is not a moment when a scientist drilled through the rock and emerged with something that changed everything. It is a slower process than that, a process of accumulation, of convergence, of independent lines of evidence being pulled together by researchers who mostly did not know about each other's work until they found their way to the same region of the unknown. It is the story of acoustic researchers following resonance to the same locations that seismic researchers had flagged for different reasons, of hydrologists finding ancient water in places where geologists found ancient voids, of geochemists finding South American plants in sediment that archaeologists dated to the same period that geneticists identified as significant for population connections, of geoglyph mappers finding dates that match the ages of the deepest acoustic and seismic anomalies. It is the story of a site that has been telling researchers something for 50 years, in the patient language of physical evidence, that they have not quite been willing to fully hear, because what it is telling them requires revisions to frameworks that feel important to maintain, revisions to the timeline of human cultural complexity, revisions to the story of how people moved around the world, revisions to the relationship between natural and cultural features of significant landscapes. The Anangu have not needed the researchers to tell them. They have known for 60,000 years. The knowledge is in the songlines. It is in the chukurpa. It is in the specific way that different sections of the rock base are named and described and associated with specific aspects of the creation story and the ceremonial law. The knowledge of the underground features, the water, the acoustic properties, the connection to other places, all of this is in the tradition, has always been there, has always been maintained. The scientists brought instruments sensitive enough to detect what the tradition had been describing, and then found themselves in the position of having detected something they could not fully explain. This is not an unusual position for science. Science is often in this position. The history of science is full of moments when instruments detected something that theory could not accommodate, and that required time and debate and new conceptual frameworks before it was properly understood. The anomaly at Uluru is not unique in kind. It is unusual in degree, in the extent to which multiple independent disciplines have arrived at compatible anomalies pointing toward the same difficult conclusion. What comes next is genuinely uncertain. The access restrictions mean that the most direct form of investigation, going underground, is not currently available, but the indirect evidence continues to accumulate. Satellite imagery is improving. Remote sensing technology is advancing. Techniques for non-invasive subsurface investigation are becoming more sensitive. The possibility of eventually characterizing the underground features in sufficient detail to say something definitive about their nature and origin without any drilling or excavation is not out of reach, and the relationship between the research community and the Anangu continues to evolve. There are researchers who have developed the kind of trust and partnership with Anangu custodians that makes collaborative investigation possible. There are knowledge holders who have found researchers whose approach aligns well enough with Anangu protocols to be worth engaging with. The conversations are happening, slowly, on the terms the custodians set, but they are happening. What the conversations eventually produce, what form the further investigation takes, and what it ultimately reveals about the underground features of Uluru and their connections to other parts of the world remains to be seen. The chambers, if chambers they are still in the dark. The water is still in the rock. The acoustic resonance still marks the same locations that it has marked for 60,000 years. And the Anangu knowledge, patient and precise and older than any scientific instrument, continues to say what it has always said, that the rock is connected, that what is underneath connects to what is beyond, that the paths run underground as well as overground, and that the underground paths are the most important of all. The researchers have their instruments. The tradition has its knowledge. The question of what is beneath Uluru sits at the intersection of these two ways of knowing, in the space where they have not yet fully bridged the gap between them. And in that space, in the quiet at the center of a continent that has been inhabited longer than anywhere else on Earth, in the darkness below the red rock and above the ancient water, something waits to be understood. We do not know exactly what it is. That is the honest answer. That is what decades of careful research from multiple disciplines has produced. Not a solution, but a sharper version of the question. But we know more than we did. We know the underground features are real. We know the water is ancient. We know the resonance is not imagined. We know the connections to other parts of the world are not coincidental, even if we cannot yet trace their specific historical form. We know the Anangu knowledge is more reliable than it was ever given credit for being by the outsiders who first arrived at this site and thought they understood it from the surface. And we know that the standard story, the story of a big, beautiful geological formation in the middle of the Australian desert, significant for its scale and its color and its cultural importance to the traditional custodians, but essentially a rock among rocks, a natural feature no more mysterious than any other impressive geological formation on any other continent. That story does not fit the evidence, does not account for the seismic anomalies, does not explain the ancient water, does not address the acoustic properties, does not resolve the genetic signal, does not account for the South American geochemical markers, does not explain the geoglyphs and their dates. Something is there, something we do not yet have adequate language to describe, something that the Anangu have been describing for 60,000 years in their own language, their own framework, their own tradition of knowledge, and that Western science has spent 50 years detecting the edges of without yet being able to see the whole. Uluru is not just a rock, it never was. The red desert holds its silence, the ancient sandstone catches the last light of another day, and somewhere below the surface, in the darkness where the oldest water on the continent still sits in the same rock it entered 12,000 years ago, the question waits. What did they build down there? Who built it? When? And where did the paths that led to it come from? And where did they go? These are the questions that the research has produced. These are the questions that the evidence demands we take seriously. And these are the questions that will define the next chapter of this investigation. Whenever the ground is opened and the darkness is entered and the instruments are run and the results are read by researchers who have the courage to report what they find, even when what they find does not fit the story they were taught to tell. The rock will be there when that day comes. It has been there for 550 million years. It can wait. But the knowledge of what it holds, preserved across 60 millennia in the tradition of the people who have never left its side, may not wait indefinitely. Knowledge transmitted through living people in living traditions is not as permanent as stone. It requires care and continuity and the presence of people who carry it and pass it on. The Anangu elders who hold the deepest layers of the Chukopa knowledge of Uluru are not eternal. The tradition is alive, but it is maintained by people, and people require the conditions for cultural continuity to be in place. This is another reason why the relationship between the research community and the Anangu custodians matters not just as a matter of ethical respect, but as a matter of practical necessity. If the deepest knowledge about what is beneath Uluru exists anywhere in a form that can be accessed, it exists in that tradition, and the tradition will only share what it knows to the extent it shares it at all, with people who have earned the right to receive it through the patient building of genuine partnership and trust. The chambers wait, the water is there, the resonance marks the locations. The evidence points underground, and the people who know the most about it, who have always known, are sitting with the knowledge in the shadow of the rock, watching the sun move across the sky, watching the color of the stone change from deep red to near purple to something that has no name in any European language, watching with the patience of a people who have always known that the most important things cannot be rushed. They will share what they share when they share it, and when they do, the story of what is beneath Uluru will finally be told in full, not in the fragments and anomalies that the instruments have been assembling for 50 years, but in the whole, clear, ancient knowledge that has been waiting for the right kind of listening. That day has not come yet, but the evidence suggests it is getting closer. The rock breathes in the dark. The water moves in the stone. The paths run underground, connecting this place to other places across distances that should be impossible, across times that should be beyond remembering. And somewhere below the surface of the oldest landscape on Earth, in the darkness that has never been entered by anyone with the means to document what they found, the answer sits, waiting, patient as stone, old as the water, connected to everything. There is a specific kind of silence at Uluru at 3 in the morning. Not the silence of an empty room or the silence of a quiet neighborhood after midnight. A different quality entirely. A silence that has texture, that has depth, that feels, to the people who have experienced it, like the land itself is doing something. Not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something else. Something for which the English language has no precise term, though several other languages do. The Anangu have terms for this. For the specific quality of attention that the landscape demands at certain hours and in certain conditions. The way the desert night around Uluru, when the moon is down and the temperature has dropped, and the stars are so dense that the sky itself seems to have weight, produces a particular state of awareness in the person present to it. Not sleep, not wakefulness in the ordinary sense. Something between and beyond both. Researchers who have spent field time at the site, people trained in the skeptical methodologies of Western science, who went there to measure and sample and record and analyze, have described this experience in field notes and interviews in ways that are remarkably consistent. Not because they were told what to expect, not because they were primed for it by prior accounts, but because the experience itself is consistent. The site produces it regardless of who is present. The acoustic team documented it, the geologist mentioned it. Archaeological field teams working near the base of the rock have written about it in ways that sit just at the edges of the kind of language that tends to get redacted from formal publications, but that make it into memoirs and interviews and the kinds of conversations that happen at conferences after the formal sessions are done. What they are describing is not mystical in any dramatic sense. It is not visions or voices or encounters with supernatural entities. It is something quieter and stranger than that. It is the feeling of the place as active, as doing something, as engaged with them in a way that a piece of landscape does not normally seem to be engaged with the people passing through it. The feeling that the attention goes both ways, that the site is, in whatever sense this can be meant, without departing from the realm of describable experience, aware of their presence and interested in what they are doing there. The Anangu would find this completely unremarkable. This is exactly what they have always said. The rock is a living presence. The ancestral beings whose activity shaped the landscape during the creation time are still present in it. The creative energy of the songline still moves through it. The place is not passive. It has never been passive. What makes the researchers' accounts interesting is not that they confirm the Anangu framework, which they do not. Not in any simple sense, because the researchers are working in a different conceptual system and are describing experiences, not making metaphysical claims. What makes the accounts interesting is that they are consistent, not with each other in the sense of having been compared and calibrated, consistent in the sense of being produced independently by different people with different backgrounds and different purposes who spent time at the same site. Consistency without coordination is the thing that distinguishes genuine perceptual signal from suggestion or projection. When 3 people in the same room are told that a place is haunted and all 3 subsequently feel uneasy, that is suggestion. When 3 people on different occasions with no prior knowledge of the site's reputation independently describe a specific quality of attention and presence in a specific location, that is something else. That is the kind of data that demands investigation even when the available frameworks are inadequate to the task of explaining it. The acoustic measurements gave one kind of explanation. The resonance is real. The specific frequencies that the site produces in response to natural sound or deliberate sound are in a range that has real effects on human perception and physiology. Low-frequency resonance of the kind documented at Uluru has measurable effects on the nervous system, on heart rate, on the quality of attention, on the state of alertness or calm. These effects have been studied in other contexts, in anechoic chambers and in resonant architectural spaces, and in the context of specific musical experiences, and they are not mysterious in a way that requires any explanation beyond physics and neuroscience. But the acoustic explanation does not fully account for everything that has been reported, because the perceptual experience people describe at Uluru is not limited to locations where the acoustic resonance is strongest. It is distributed across the base of the rock in ways that suggest multiple contributing factors, of which the acoustic environment is certainly one but not the only one. The thermal mass of the rock, the specific quality of the light at different times of day and night, the visual scale of the formation, which dwarfs the human observer in a way that has known perceptual effects on the sense of self and context, the geological composition of the surface, which produces effects of color and texture that are unusual and that engage the visual system in persistent ways. All of these are contributing factors. All of them have been studied to varying degrees, and their aggregate effect on a human observer who spends significant time in close proximity to the base of Uluru is to produce a particular kind of altered baseline, not an altered state in the clinical sense, not an unusual or pathological perceptual condition, simply a consistent and reproducible shift in the quality of awareness that the environment induces. This shift in awareness is relevant to the investigation of the underground features in ways that the researchers have not always articulated, but that the Anangu understand very well. In the Chukopa framework, knowing the underground nature of Uluru is not primarily a matter of having access to geological survey data or borehole results. It is a matter of being in the right relationship with the place, of having the sensitivity to perceive what the place is expressing, of attending to the site in a way that allows the site's own character to become available to perception. This sounds, in the context of Western science, like an argument for intuition over evidence, for subjective experience over objective measurement. And that is not quite right, because in the Anangu framework, the knowledge gained from deep and long engagement with a place is not subjective in the sense of being personal and idiosyncratic. It is intersubjective. It is shared. It is transmitted between people who have developed the same quality of relationship with the same place over generations. It is tested against reality in the sense that knowledge that led people wrong, that caused them to misread the landscape or make bad decisions about water or food or navigation, would have been corrected over time. The Anangu knowledge of Uluru is the product of 60,000 years of testing against reality, not with scientific instruments, with lives, with the ongoing experience of what happened when you used the knowledge well, and what happened when you departed from it. The tradition that survived those 60,000 years is one that, in all the areas where it can be compared to physical evidence, has been accurate. This does not mean every element of the tradition is accurate in a simple factual sense. Traditions carry layers of meaning and narrative and interpretation along with the factual knowledge. Distinguishing between them requires the same careful analysis that distinguishes signal from noise in any dataset. But the baseline of reliability that the Anangu tradition has demonstrated means that when it says something is underground, it deserves to be taken seriously. And when it says that what is underground connects this place to other places, that too deserves to be taken seriously. Even before the genetic data and the geochemical data and the geoglyph data arrived to independently suggest the same thing. The history of Uluru's investigation has a quality of inexorable accumulation. Facts that start as anomalies become patterns. Patterns that start as speculations become hypotheses. Hypotheses that start as too uncomfortable to test become too well supported to ignore. This process takes time. It is measured in decades, not in moments of dramatic discovery. But it is real, and it continues. The most recent strand of evidence to enter the weave concerns something that researchers in a completely different field, studying a completely different problem, stumbled upon in data collected for an entirely different purpose. Satellite imaging of the Central Australian landscape, originally collected as part of a project monitoring vegetation change and land surface temperature over time, was processed by researchers looking for patterns in the distribution of surface mineral concentrations. This is not exotic science. Remote sensing analysis of surface mineralogy from satellite data is a standard technique in geology and mineral exploration. The algorithms that extract mineral information from satellite spectral data have been refined over decades and are well established. What the analysis returned for the region around Uluru, when run at a spatial resolution higher than had been previously applied to this specific area, was a pattern of surface mineral concentration that did not match the expected distribution for the geology of the region. In the area surrounding Uluru, extending outward in a rough pattern from the base of the rock, the surface mineral concentration showed traces of material that was not consistent with the local geology. The material was present in very small amounts, below the threshold that earlier, lower resolution surveys would have detected, but detectable in the higher resolution analysis. And the distribution of this material was not random. It followed a spatial pattern that corresponded, when mapped, to the directions of the subsurface linear features identified in the 2009 geophysical survey. The material itself was not dramatically anomalous. It was not a completely alien substance, but it was out of place in the sense that the geological units from which it could have naturally derived are not in the immediate vicinity of the locations where it was detected. It must have been transported, either by water, which is a common transport mechanism for mineral material in any landscape, or by some other means. The water transport hypothesis was investigated first. If the underground water network associated with Uluru is as extensive as the hydrological surveys suggest, it could plausibly transport material from one location to another over time. The distribution of the anomalous mineral material was compared to the known and inferred directions of water movement in the subsurface. Some of the distribution was consistent with water transport, some was not. The portions of the distribution that were not consistent with simple water transport were, once again, the portions that corresponded to the linear features identified in the geophysical survey, the features with orientations that did not match the expected geological directions. This residual correlation, the portion of the mineral distribution that could not be explained by water transport acting on the known geology, was small, but it was consistent across multiple samples and across multiple satellite image acquisitions taken at different times. It was robust in the statistical sense, and it added another thread to the increasingly dense weave of evidence pointing toward organized subsurface features beneath and around Uluru. The research team that produced this analysis was not the same as any of the previous teams. They had not been following the Uluru investigation. They published their findings in a remote sensing journal with no particular agenda about what the results meant. They noted the anomaly. They noted the partial correspondence with the geophysical survey data as an interesting coincidence worth further investigation, and they moved on to the next analysis. But the researchers who had been following the story for years, who had accumulated the acoustic and seismic and hydrological and geochemical and geoglyph evidence, recognized what they were seeing. Another independent line of investigation arriving at the same location from a different direction. The same pattern, the same underground structure, signaled by the sound and the water and the minerals and the plants from another continent, and the genes of living people and the symbols on rock walls and the movement of ancient water through ancient stone, all pointing at the same thing, all asking the same question: what is down there? The Forbidden Archive is not a building. It is not a vault or a repository or a classified collection in some government facility. The Forbidden Archive of Uluru is distributed. It lives in field notes and internal reports and assessment documents and research papers that were submitted but not published, or published in specialist journals with limited circulation, or published in modified forms that did not include the findings that made the authors most uncomfortable. It lives in interview transcripts and conference presentations and informal conversations between researchers who trusted each other enough to say things they were not ready to say in print. It is not forbidden in the sense of having been deliberately suppressed by anyone with the power to make that happen. It is more subtle than that. It is the kind of archive that accumulates when a subject matter is uncomfortable for a scientific community to address fully, when the findings that keep appearing do not fit the established frameworks, when the implications of taking the evidence seriously are more than the academic culture can easily absorb. The researchers who generated these findings are not rogue scientists or credulous enthusiasts or advocates for alternative history. They are credentialed professionals who went to a site to study something specific, found something else along the way, and then faced the challenge of deciding what to do with what they found. In most cases, they did what scientists do with anomalies. They noted them, they put them in the record, they flagged them as requiring further investigation, and they moved on to the main purpose of their work. The Uluru Anomaly Archive is full of these notes, full of parenthetical observations and appended footnotes and sections of discussion that trail off with phrases like "the significance of this observation remains unclear," or "this finding may warrant further investigation," or "the authors do not wish to speculate beyond the scope of the present data." What would it look like to actually gather all of these distributed observations and place them in a single coherent account? Not interpreted, not built into a grand narrative about ancient connections and underground chambers and forbidden history, just presented as a record, as what the evidence actually says, without the hedging and the moderation and the careful distance that the academic context requires. It would look like what this investigation has been building toward. It would show a site that has been producing anomalous readings from multiple independent instruments for 50 years. A site where the underground structure is more organized than natural geology comfortably explains. where the water is older than the landscape looks, where the acoustic properties concentrate in locations that are both geophysically and culturally significant, where the surrounding landscape shows evidence of modification at dates that push against the accepted timeline of human activity, where the genetics of the people who live there, and have lived there longer than anyone has lived anywhere, connect to populations on the other side of the world in ways that require explanation, where the sediment holds compounds from plants that should not be there, where the symbols on the walls echo symbols from traditions that should never have been in contact. That is the archive. That is what 50 years of investigation by credentialed scientists in multiple disciplines has produced. Not proof of any specific interpretation, but evidence that something is wrong with the standard account. Evidence that the standard story of what Uluru is and what happened in its surrounding landscape in the deep past is incomplete at best and actively misleading at worst. The standard story says it is a rock, a very old, very beautiful, very geologically interesting and culturally significant rock in the middle of an arid continent. That the Aboriginal people who have lived beside it for 60,000 years have built an extraordinarily rich and sophisticated cultural tradition around it, a tradition that deserves respect and protection. That the geological and ecological features of the site are remarkable in their scale and in the specific physical properties they exhibit, but are ultimately explicable within standard natural frameworks. The evidence archive says that this story is missing something, that the underground structures are more organized than natural processes explain, that the connections to other parts of the world are too specific and too multiply confirmed to be dismissed as coincidence, that the knowledge the Anangu have maintained is more precisely accurate than a purely cultural tradition of storytelling would be expected to produce, that something happened here in the deep past that the standard story does not account for. That something involved the land below the surface, and it involved people on the other side of the world in a time before any accepted model of transoceanic contact would place them in communication with each other. This is what the archive says. These are the forbidden findings that are not forbidden by anyone's deliberate decision, but by the accumulated weight of a scientific culture that finds them uncomfortable and that has deferred the full reckoning with what they mean for as long as the evidence has allowed that deferral to continue. The evidence no longer allows it as comfortably as it once did. There is a concept in systems thinking called a strange attractor. In dynamical systems, an attractor is a state or set of states that a system tends toward over time regardless of where it starts. A strange attractor is one that is not a simple point or a simple cycle, but a complex structure that the system orbits around without ever exactly repeating the same path. The evidence about Uluru has something like a strange attractor quality. Wherever the investigation begins, whatever the initial question is, whatever discipline the researcher brings to the site, the findings keep orbiting around the same set of conclusions without ever quite arriving at a definitive statement of them. Acoustics finds the resonance, geophysics finds the voids, hydrology finds the ancient water, archaeology finds the anomalous dates, genetics finds the impossible connections, geochemistry finds the South American plants, satellite imaging finds the anomalous minerals. The Anangu tradition says the underground features connect this place to others. All of these different approaches, coming from different directions with different instruments and different questions, keep arriving in the same neighborhood, keep pointing at the same underground structure, keep gesturing at the same ancient connections, keep producing findings that, taken individually, might be dismissed or deferred, but that taken together form a pattern of such consistent direction that the dismissal becomes increasingly untenable. The pattern has been accumulating for 50 years. It is not getting less consistent as more evidence is added. It is getting more consistent. Each new thread that enters the investigation from an independent direction reinforces rather than contradicts the existing threads. This is the opposite of what happens with spurious patterns. Spurious patterns dissolve when new evidence is added. Real patterns strengthen. The pattern at Uluru is strengthening. What it will eventually reveal, when the access is available and the instruments are sensitive enough and the partnership between the research community and the Anangu custodians has developed to the point where genuine collaborative investigation is possible, remains to be seen. The underground chambers, if the seismic and acoustic and borehole evidence accurately reflects what is there, may contain nothing, may be empty geological features, interesting but ultimately explicable without any revision to existing timelines or frameworks. They may contain material that is obviously ancient and obviously significant, rock art of a kind not found at the surface, artifacts, organic material with datable ages, evidence of human activity at a depth and age that pushes the known record of human presence at this site substantially earlier than it currently stands. Or they may contain something that defies easy categorization, something that requires new concepts rather than simply extending existing ones. Something that the Anangu description of as channels and connections is more adequate to than any category Western science currently deploys. All of these possibilities are real. None of them is obviously more likely than the others based on the evidence available so far. The evidence says something is there and that the something is significant. It does not say what. This is the honest place to stop. Not because the story is over, but because the evidence has taken us as far as it can take us without the direct investigation that has not yet been permitted. The accumulating threads of research have built a strong case that the underground features of Uluru are real and significant, and connected to a broader story about the human deep past. The threads continue to accumulate, the pattern continues to cohere, but the resolution waits underground, below the ancient red sandstone, below the oldest water, in the darkness where the acoustic resonance maps and the seismic data points and the Anangu knowledge always said there was something worth knowing. What we can say with confidence, having followed the evidence through all its independent threads, is this. The investigation of Uluru has produced a genuine scientific mystery of the first order. Not a mystery in the sense of something sensational and unexplained that probably has a boring explanation if you look hard enough. A mystery in the proper sense of a question that the available evidence makes important to answer, and that the available methods have not yet been able to answer fully. The underground features are real, the water network is ancient, the acoustic properties are unusual and specifically concentrated at locations that are independently identified as significant by both geophysical instruments and Anangu traditional knowledge. The surrounding landscape shows evidence of landscape modification at dates that push against the accepted timeline. The genetic record carries signals of connections between Australia and the Americas that the standard model cannot adequately explain. The geochemical record carries evidence of South American plant material at ages consistent with those genetic signals. The symbolic record shows parallels between the visual traditions of Central Australia and the American Southwest that are too specific to dismiss as coincidental. All of this points toward a conclusion that the standard account, a beautiful geological formation at the center of a geologically interesting continent, inhabited by a culturally sophisticated people whose traditions deserve respect, does not adequately capture that something more was happening here, in the deep past. That the site is not merely a geological feature that humans have invested with cultural significance, but a feature with properties that are genuinely and physically unusual, that may have been recognized and engaged with and possibly modified by humans across a very long period and in ways that connected this place to other places across the world. The Anangu have never said the rock was just a rock. They have maintained for 60,000 years, with an unbroken continuity that is itself one of the most remarkable facts about this site. That what is here is more than it appears. That the underground is as significant as the surface. That the connections run further than the eye can see. That the knowledge of this place is a living thing that must be cared for and maintained, because it matters in ways that go beyond the cultural and the historical and the aesthetic. The research has been approaching, from the outside and with instruments, the same conclusion that the tradition has been stating from the inside and with knowledge for 60,000 years. That is the story of what scientists found beneath Uluru, or rather, what they are finding, what they keep finding, what the evidence keeps insisting is there, in the darkness below the desert, in the ancient water and the organized stone, in the acoustic resonance and the deep geological structure, and the network of connections that the surveys keep detecting, and the tradition keeps describing. Something's there, the investigation continues, and the rock waits, as it has always waited, patient and alive and full of information that the right kind of attention, in the right kind of partnership, in the right conditions of trust and care, will eventually be able to read. There is one more thread to follow before this account is complete. A thread that has appeared in the periphery of the investigation several times, mentioned briefly and then set aside, but that deserves more direct attention. It concerns the dates, not any single date, the pattern of dates. The way that when you plot the ages of the various anomalous findings from the Uluru region against each other, a pattern emerges that is itself more organized than chance would produce. The geoglyph dates, 25,000 to 35,000 years before present. The geochemical markers, 25,000 to 35,000 years before present. The acoustic anomaly locations, corresponding to features inferred from geophysical data of the same age. The genetic divergence implied by the Australian-South American connection, 30,000 years or more before present. The bone deposit with the marked cylinder, 41,000 to 44,000 years before present. the surface cave art at Uluru. From the surface examples, some are inferred to be at the outer edge of this range or earlier. These dates do not all coincide at a single point, but they cluster. They distribute themselves across a specific window of time, roughly between 25,000 and 45,000 years before the present, with the most concentrated clustering toward the earlier part of that range. This is the period when the last glacial maximum was beginning to intensify, the period when sea levels were dropping toward their glacial minimum, the period when the landscapes of the world were changing in ways that opened some connections and closed others, the period when the land bridges of the Ice Age were at their most extensive, and when the coastal routes of the Pacific world were at their most accessible. It is also the period immediately following what the genetic evidence identifies as a significant expansion of human populations out of Africa and into the rest of the world. The Great Dispersal, the movement of modern humans across all of the world's landmasses, was in full progress during this window. The people who would eventually become the founding populations of Australia, of the Pacific Islands, of the Americas, were on the move, and the evidence from Uluru and its surrounding landscape seems to mark the passage of something during this specific period. Not just people passing through and leaving traces, something more organized, more deliberate. The geoglyphs suggest planned landscape modification. The anomalous mineral distributions suggest organized activity across the plain around the rock. The borehole data suggests the creation or expansion of underground features. The presence of South American plant material suggests connection to something beyond the continent. During the window between 25,000 and 45,000 years before the present, something organized was happening in and around Uluru. Something that left traces in the geology and the archaeology and the geochemistry and the genetics of the region. Something whose nature the available evidence cannot yet fully specify, but whose reality the evidence consistently implies. The Anangu traditions speak of a period during the creation time when the land itself was being shaped by the activities of the ancestral beings. This is the Chukurpa account of the origin of the landscape's current form. The ancestral beings moved through the landscape, and where they moved, they left the features that define it. Uluru itself, in the Chukurpa, is a feature left by the activities of the ancestral beings during this formative period. The dates of the archaeological and geochemical evidence from the region are consistent with a period when organized human activity was happening at and around the site, not the creation time in any supernatural sense, but a period when people were present, were doing things, were leaving traces, and were doing so in ways that went beyond simple occupation and subsistence. The Chukurpa is a record of that period, interpreted through the cultural and spiritual framework of a people who have maintained the memory for 60,000 years. The archaeological and geochemical evidence is the physical trace of that same period, accessible through the instruments of Western science. The two records are not saying the same things in the same language. They are describing overlapping realities in very different conceptual systems. But the period they both seem to be pointing to is the same period, the same window, the same concentrated cluster of events in the deep past. This is the deepest convergence, not between one instrument's findings and another's, but between the scientific record and the living tradition, between the physical trace and the cultural memory, between the marks left in the stone and the knowledge maintained in the song. They are both pointing to the same time. They are both describing something that happened then, in the middle of the most dramatic period of human dispersal across the planet, in the deepest part of the last ice age, when the world looked different and the connections between its parts were different, and the people who were here were doing things that we are only beginning, with all the instruments and methodologies of 21st century science, to detect. The rock was here then, the people were here then, and something was happening. The record of it is in the stone below, in the water below that, in the sound that the rock makes when you know where to listen, in the genes of the people who stayed and of the people who went somewhere else, and whose descendants now live on the other side of the world, in the marks on the walls and the patterns in the deep sediment and the anomalous minerals in the satellite data, and the resonance in the acoustic measurements and the systematic voids in the seismic return. All of it is the record of something that happened, something that the Anangu have never forgotten, something that Western science is now, slowly and incompletely, beginning to detect. The investigation of what scientists found beneath Uluru is not over. It is ongoing. It will continue to produce findings that accumulate toward a conclusion that the existing frameworks are not yet fully adequate to express. But the direction of the accumulation is clear. The pattern is coherent. The evidence is consistent across independent disciplines and independent lines of inquiry. Something's there, something's connected, something happened in this place, in this time, that the world does not yet fully understand. The rock knows, the people know, and the investigation will continue until the science catches up with what the tradition has always said. In the red silence of the central Australian desert, under the ancient stars, above the ancient water, the answer waits, patient as the stone, old as the water, connected to everything. The investigation continues, the evidence accumulates, the pattern strengthens. And somewhere below the desert floor, in the darkness that no outside researcher has entered and documented, the chambers wait. The water moves slowly through ancient stone. The resonance marks the locations that matter most. The connections run underground and across the ocean and through the genes of living people, and through the sounds that specific frequencies make when they encounter specific surfaces of very old rock, all of it pointing in the same direction. All of it saying the same thing. Something is beneath Uluru, something that connected this place to the rest of the world in the deepest part of human time. Something that the people who have always been here have never forgotten, and something that science, given enough time and enough care and enough genuine partnership with those who hold the knowledge, will one day fully understand. That day has not yet come, but it is coming. The rock waits, the water is patient. And the knowledge, old and careful and precisely maintained across 60,000 years of unbroken transmission, knows what is there. It has always known. There is a question that the investigation of Uluru has not yet directly confronted, a question that sits behind all the specific findings and the specific debates and the specific convergences of evidence from different disciplines. It is the most fundamental question, the one that the specific findings are all pointing toward without quite stating, and it is this. What kind of place is Uluru? Not what kind of geological formation, not what kind of sacred site in the cultural framework of the Anangu, not what kind of heritage-listed natural wonder, but in the most basic ontological sense, the sense that asks not how we categorize it, but what it actually is. What kind of thing is this rock in the desert? The geological answer is accurate as far as it goes. It is a large remnant of a deeply buried sandstone formation, exposed by erosion over hundreds of millions of years, with a chemical composition and a physical structure and a geological history that are well understood. This is true. The anthropological answer is accurate as far as it goes. It is the central sacred site of the Anangu people, embedded in a living tradition of knowledge and practice that has been continuous for at least 60,000 years, connected to a network of significant sites across the Australian continent through the songline system, and maintained through a body of knowledge called the Chukopa that is actively practiced and transmitted by living people. This is also true. The question is whether either of these answers, or both of them together, is adequate. Whether the total of what can be said about Uluru within these two frameworks leaves anything out. And the answer that the evidence, accumulated over 50 years of investigation from multiple disciplines, seems to be giving is yes, something's left out. Something that neither the standard geological account nor the standard anthropological account fully captures. Something about the physical nature of the site that the instruments keep detecting, but that the existing categories do not adequately name. The evidence for something physically unusual about Uluru that goes beyond what the standard accounts explain is, at this point, substantial. The underground features, the water, the acoustic properties, the pattern of geological anomalies. The way the site's physical characteristics repeatedly correlate with the specific locations that the Anangu traditions identify as most significant. These are not things that the standard accounts explain. They are things the standard accounts have to set aside or defer or hedge about when confronted with them. But the evidence for connection, for the site's relationship to places far away and times long past, is where the investigation opens into territory that the existing categories simply do not have adequate language for. The genetic signals, the geochemical markers, the symbolic parallels, the implied movement of people and materials and ideas between this place and the Americas in a period that the standard model of human dispersal and cultural development does not accommodate. These things require a different kind of account, not a supernatural account, not an appeal to forces or beings or events outside the natural world, but a natural account that is more comprehensive than the one we currently have. One that includes, as part of the natural world and the natural history of human activity, things that our current frameworks place outside the possible. The human past is deeper and stranger and more connected than the standard accounts suggest. This is not a radical claim. It is what the evidence from multiple fields has been accumulating toward for decades. The genetic evidence shows that human populations were moving and mixing and diverging and reconnecting in patterns more complex than simple family trees depict. The archaeological evidence shows that human technological and cultural complexity is significantly older than the standard timeline suggests. The cognitive science evidence shows that the human capacity for symbolic thought, for abstract reasoning, for complex cultural transmission, is older than the cognitive revolution model implies. Uluru sits at the intersection of all of these correctives to the standard account. The genetic evidence finds its most striking anomalies in the populations connected to this region. The archaeological evidence finds some of its most problematic dates in this landscape. The acoustic and geophysical evidence finds physical features of the site that the standard geological account does not explain. And the traditional knowledge of the Anangu, which has been maintained across a span of time that makes it the oldest continuously existing body of human knowledge on Earth, describes the site in ways that keep proving more accurate than any outside investigator initially expected. What kind of place is Uluru? It is a place where the standard accounts fail more completely and more consistently than almost anywhere else on Earth. A place where the evidence for something more complex and more ancient and more connected keeps coming in from independent directions. A place where the living tradition and the physical evidence and the genetic record and the geochemical record and the acoustic measurements all point in the same direction and say the same basic thing. What is here goes deeper and further than the surface suggests. This is what the scientists found beneath Uluru. Not a single dramatic discovery, but a pattern of findings so consistent and so convergent that the pattern itself is the discovery. The pattern says, look again, look harder, look with better instruments and more genuine partnership with those who hold the knowledge. Look without the assumption that the existing frameworks are adequate to account for what is here. The pattern says the story is not over. It says the investigation has produced a sharper and more detailed version of the question rather than an answer. It says that what the science has found beneath Uluru is the beginning of a deeper investigation into the deep past of this continent and its connections to the rest of the world. That investigation is ongoing. The instruments are improving. The partnerships are being built. The evidence is accumulating, and the rock is waiting, as it has always waited, with the patience of something that has been here for 500 million years, and knows that the questions of any particular era are small against the span of time it has witnessed. The Anangu have a word for the quality of timeless, complete presence that the deep creation accounts describe, a quality of existing fully and completely in a way that is not subject to the ordinary passage of time, not immortality in the simple sense of not dying, something different, a quality of being so fundamental to the fabric of the world that the world cannot exist without it, that it is not a thing in the world, but a condition of the world. Uluru in the Anangu framework is not merely a place that has been important for a long time. It is a place where the fabric of the world itself is most directly accessible, where what underlies the ordinary surface of things, what the creation accounts describe as the foundational reality of which ordinary events are the surface expression, is closest to being directly perceivable. Western science has no adequate category for this kind of claim, but Western science has instruments that keep finding, at the specific locations the Anangu identify as the places where this foundational reality is most accessible, physical features that are more unusual than the surrounding landscape, the acoustic resonance, the geophysical anomalies, the hydrological properties, the mineral distributions, all concentrated at the locations where the tradition says the foundational is most present. This convergence is the most remarkable single finding of the entire investigation. Not the specific anomalies themselves, the convergence, the fact that independent physical measurements keep identifying the same locations as anomalous that the Anangu tradition has always identified as most significant. This tells us that whatever the Anangu tradition is tracking, it is tracking something real, something physically present, something that the instruments can detect when pointed in the right direction. The framework in which the tradition describes that reality is different from the framework of the instruments, but the underlying reality they are both responding to appears to be the same. That is the deepest finding of the investigation. The tradition and the instruments are responding to the same physical features. The tradition is not describing a purely symbolic or cultural significance attached to an otherwise ordinary location. It is describing, in its own language and framework, something that is physically unusual about specific locations at the site. Something that the tradition has known about for 60,000 years, and that the instruments are only now sensitive enough to detect. This finding, if it is taken seriously, has implications beyond Uluru. It has implications for how we understand the relationship between traditional knowledge systems and scientific investigation. For whether traditional knowledge deserves to be treated as hypothesis-generating data rather than merely as cultural material to be documented and respected, but not taken as pointing toward physical facts. For whether the 60,000 years of Anangu engagement with this landscape contains information about it that Western science should be taking more seriously as a guide to investigation. The answer that the Uluru evidence suggests is yes. The traditional knowledge has proven to be a reliable guide to physical features that the science later confirmed. This means it should be treated as a reliable guide to physical features that the science has not yet confirmed. It means the Anangu descriptions of the underground features, of the nature of the water network, of the connections between this site and other places, should be generating scientific hypotheses and guiding research priorities rather than being treated as cultural material separate from the scientific investigation. This is a methodological point as much as a philosophical one. The most efficient path to understanding what is beneath Uluru may not be to gather more independent physical evidence from outside instruments. It may be to engage more deeply with the knowledge system that has been investigating this site for 60,000 years, and that has a consistent track record of being right about its physical features. This requires a different kind of scientific practice than the one that has dominated the Uluru investigation so far. One that treats the traditional knowledge holders not as subjects of anthropological study or as stakeholders to be consulted for permission, but as primary sources of information about the physical nature of the site. One that asks not what the instruments say, and separately what the tradition says, but what we can understand about the site when both are engaged as sources of knowledge about the same physical reality. Some researchers have been working toward this kind of practice. The conversations are happening, the partnerships are being built. The methodological frameworks for integrating traditional knowledge with scientific investigation are being developed not just for Uluru, but for sites around the world where similar relationships between traditional knowledge and physical evidence exist. This is the direction the investigation needs to go, not more independent measurements from outside, more genuine collaboration with the inside knowledge, more engagement with the 60,000-year record of careful attention to this specific place that the Anangu tradition represents. When that collaboration deepens, when the partnership becomes genuine enough that the full depth of the Anangu knowledge about the underground features can be shared with and engaged by researchers who have the instruments to investigate those features, the investigation of what is beneath Uluru will enter a new phase. A phase in which the question is no longer whether something is there, but what exactly it is and what it means. That phase has not begun yet, but the conditions for it are being built, slowly and carefully, and on the terms of the people whose knowledge is most relevant to the investigation. And when it does begin, the story of what scientists found beneath Uluru will enter its most significant chapter, the one where the accumulated evidence is engaged with directly, where the underground features are characterized with sufficient precision to allow definitive interpretation, where the connection between this place and the Americas, and between this place and the deep human past more broadly, can be traced in enough detail to understand its specific historical form. What that chapter will reveal is genuinely unknown. That is not false modesty or evasion. It is the honest state of the evidence. The investigation has produced a powerful pattern pointing towards something significant underground. The investigation has produced convergent evidence for ancient connections between this site and other parts of the world. But the investigation has not yet produced the direct access to the underground features that would allow those things to be characterized precisely. The investigation continues, the evidence accumulates, the pattern becomes more coherent with each new thread that enters it, and the question of what is beneath Uluru remains open, clearly important, increasingly well-defined, and not yet answered. This is the current state of one of the most significant unresolved mysteries in the scientific investigation of the human deep past, a mystery that has been accumulating evidence for 50 years without producing a resolution. A mystery that involves the oldest continuous human culture on Earth, the most intensively studied geological formation in Australia, and a pattern of underground features and ancient connections that multiple independent disciplines have been detecting and failing to adequately explain for half a century. The rock knows what it holds, the water in the stone is patient, the acoustic resonance still marks the same locations it has marked for as long as humans have been listening. And the knowledge that the Anangu have maintained for 60,000 years, precise and accurate and responsive to the physical reality of the site in ways that the scientific investigation has repeatedly confirmed, continues to describe the underground features and the connections and the significance of this place in a framework that Western science has not yet fully learned to hear, but it is learning. The instruments are getting more sensitive. The partnerships are getting deeper, the methodological frameworks are getting more sophisticated, and the evidence, patient and consistent and convergent, keeps pointing underground. Something's there, the investigation will continue until it is found. And when it is found, what we understand about the human deep past, about the ancient connections between the world's most isolated continent and the rest of the globe, about the relationship between living knowledge traditions and the physical landscapes they have tracked for 60 millennia, will be fundamentally and permanently changed. The red rock stands in the desert. The sun moves across the sky. The color of the stone shifts through its ancient range of red and purple, and something that has no name. The Anangu carry their knowledge. The researchers carry their instruments. The underground structure waits, patient in the dark, old beyond any human reckoning, full of whatever it has always held. The investigation continues. The story is not over. It is just reaching the point where the question has been asked clearly enough and supported by enough evidence from enough independent directions that the answer can no longer be indefinitely deferred. Something is there, beneath Uluru, in the ancient dark, in the oldest water on the continent, in the organized stone and the resonant air, and the network of underground paths that the surveys have detected, and the tradition has always described. Something's there. And the world is beginning to understand that finding out what it is may be one of the most important things the investigation of the human past can do. The rock waits, patient, alive, full of knowledge. The investigation continues. To understand the full weight of what the investigation of Uluru has been approaching, you need to sit with a number for a moment. 60,000 years. The minimum estimate of how long the Anangu and their predecessors have been present at this site. Not 60,000 years of casual presence, of occasional passing through. 60,000 years of continuous residence, of sustained and detailed engagement with every aspect of this landscape, of generation after generation of people living their entire lives within a few days' walk of this rock, learning it, listening to it, building a body of knowledge about it, and about the web of connections it sits within that is more detailed and more accurately maintained than any externally derived account of the site could possibly be. 60,000 years is longer than all of recorded human history combined. It is longer than the age of agriculture, longer than the age of pottery, longer than the oldest evidence of permanent human settlement anywhere in the world. It is, to put it as plainly as possible, an incomprehensibly long time for a body of knowledge about a specific place to be maintained in an unbroken chain of transmission from person to person. But it has been maintained. The Anangu tradition is not a relic or a reconstruction or a revival. It is a living system of knowledge that has been actively practiced and transmitted and tested against the reality of this landscape for the entire duration of human occupation of this site. The knowledge has not been frozen in the form it took 60,000 years ago. It has been updated, refined, supplemented by new observation and new experience. Knowledge systems that survive for that duration do so not by being static, but by being responsive, by incorporating new information while maintaining the integrity of the core. What the core of the Anangu knowledge says about Uluru, the things that have been maintained across all the changes and adaptations of 60 millennia of living tradition, is what the investigation keeps returning to. The underground nature of the site, the water, the acoustic properties, the connections to other places, the significance of specific locations in ways that the instruments keep confirming. These are the constants. These are the things the tradition has been saying long enough that they must be considered the most reliable elements, the ones that have been tested against reality the most times and that have survived the testing. The investigation of what scientists found beneath Uluru is, at its deepest level, an investigation of what happens when a living knowledge system that has been engaged with a specific place for 60,000 years meets a scientific investigation that has been engaged with the same place for 50 years. What each finds when it looks, whether what they find is the same, and what it means when it turns out that in the areas that can be compared, they keep finding the same things. The answer is the tradition knew about the water, about the acoustic properties, about the underground structure, about the connections to other places. The tradition knew maintained that knowledge across 60,000 years of careful transmission, and the instruments that Western science pointed at the site 50 years ago began detecting the same things the tradition had always described. This is not a story about indigenous knowledge being vindicated by Western science. That framing is condescending in both directions. It implies that the traditional knowledge needed Western science to confirm it before it deserved to be taken seriously. And it implies that Western science was doing something generous by finding what the tradition had always known. Neither of these is quite right. It is a story about two knowledge systems using different methods and different conceptual frameworks, engaging with the same physical reality and arriving at compatible descriptions of it. Compatible, not identical. The Anangu framework describes the underground features in terms of ancestral beings and living forces, and the laws of the Chokupa. The geophysical instruments describe them in terms of acoustic impedance contrasts and seismic reflection coefficients and pressure measurements. These are different languages for different aspects of a shared reality. The fact that they converge on the same locations and the same general structural features is what is significant. This convergence suggests that both knowledge systems are responding to something real, that the physical features of the site are genuinely unusual in the ways both descriptions imply, that neither account is simply projecting a culturally determined framework onto a neutral landscape, that the landscape itself has properties that both a living tradition and a scientific instrument can detect, and that those properties are consistent between what the tradition detects and what the instrument detects. This is the most important finding of the entire investigation, more important than any specific measurement or any specific anomalous result. The convergence of two independent knowledge systems on the same physical features is evidence that those features are real in a way that neither knowledge system's findings alone could establish. And the features that both systems converge on are genuinely unusual. The underground structure, the acoustic properties, the water network, the connections to other places. These are not things that either the geological account or the anthropological account, taken alone, predicted or fully explained. They are things that both the tradition and the instruments detected, and that neither the standard geological narrative nor the standard anthropological narrative has been able to adequately incorporate. They are the mystery, the real mystery, the thing that the investigation keeps circling without yet resolving, the thing that both the living knowledge of the Anangu and the accumulated measurements of Western science agree is there, even as they disagree about how to describe it and what it means. What is the underground structure? What are the chambers? What was the water network for? What are the connections that both the songlines and the genetic data and the geochemical data and the acoustic data keep pointing at? These are the questions. These are the things that are beneath Uluru, not just in the physical sense of being underground, but in the deeper sense of being underneath the investigation itself. The questions that the investigation has been uncovering for 50 years without quite reaching them directly. And they will be answered, not immediately, not without difficulty, not without the kind of genuine partnership between Western scientific practice and Anangu traditional knowledge that takes time and care and mutual respect to build. But they will be answered, because the evidence for them is too strong and to multiply confirmed to remain permanently unaddressed, because the instruments will continue to improve and the data will continue to accumulate, because the partnerships between researchers and custodians are being built even now in the careful way that such partnerships have to be built, because the question of what is beneath Uluru is too important, both for our understanding of the deep human past and for our understanding of the relationship between traditional knowledge and scientific investigation, to be left permanently in the holding pattern it has occupied for decades. The rock will be understood, not exploited, not excavated carelessly, not approached with the contempt for indigenous knowledge that characterized the early period of Western engagement with this site, but understood, in partnership, in a way that honors both the 60,000 years of Anangu knowledge and the 50 years of scientific investigation, in a way that recognizes both as sources of knowledge about the same physical reality. When that understanding comes, what it reveals about the deep human past, about the ancient connections between Australia and the Americas, about what people were doing in this landscape 25,000 to 45,000 years ago, will be one of the most significant contributions to human self-knowledge that the investigation of archaeology and geology and genetics has ever produced. The rock waits with its usual patience for the investigation to catch up with what it has always held, and the Anangu, who have never not known, watch the investigation approach, generation by generation, instrument by instrument, partnership by partnership, toward the knowledge they have maintained since before the last ice age ended, and the seas rose to their current levels, and the land bridges disappeared beneath the ocean, and the world became the world we know today. The investigation continues. The pattern strengthens, the evidence accumulates, the question sharpens. What is beneath Uluru? Something ancient, something organized, something connected, something that the oldest continuous human knowledge tradition on Earth has always described, and that Western science has been detecting for 50 years without quite being able to fully see. something that matters, for what we know about where we came from and how we got here and what humans were doing in this world in the deepest, least documented, most mysterious period of our existence on this planet. That is the story of what scientists found beneath Uluru. Not a single finding, but a pattern. Not an answer, but a question made clear enough, and supported by enough evidence from enough independent directions that the world is beginning to understand that it needs to be answered. The rock knows what it holds. The investigation will continue until we do too. Let us slow down here, because there is something about the way this investigation unfolds that deserves careful attention in itself. Not just the findings, the structure of the investigation, the way in which a subject that touches on the deepest questions of human history keeps producing evidence from unexpected directions that all converge on the same uncomfortable conclusion, and yet keeps failing to reach the definitive resolution that would settle the question. This pattern is not unique to Uluru. It appears in several areas of human prehistory where the evidence challenges established timelines or accepted models. The debate about the peopling of the Americas, the debate about the age of symbolic behavior in Homo sapiens, the debate about the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans and what their coexistence looked like, the debate about the origins of agriculture and whether it arose independently in multiple places or spread from a smaller number of centers of innovation. In each of these debates, the pattern is similar. Evidence accumulates from multiple independent directions. The evidence is resistant to dismissal because it comes from too many sources, but it is also resistant to full acceptance because it would require revision of frameworks that are deeply embedded in the disciplinary culture of the relevant sciences. So it sits in a kind of productive tension, generating more research, producing more evidence, refining the question without quite answering it, until the weight of evidence eventually becomes too great to set aside and the frameworks shift. The Uluru investigation is in this pattern. It has been in this pattern for 50 years. The evidence for something significant underground, for ancient connections to other parts of the world, for human activity at the site in a period that pushes against the accepted timeline, has been accumulating for 50 years without producing the framework shift that would fully incorporate it. Why? Part of the reason is access. The direct investigation that would definitively characterize the underground features requires access to the underground, and that access requires an Anangu permission. And that permission requires a level of trust and partnership that has been building slowly and is not yet complete. Part of the reason is disciplinary. The evidence for something unusual at Uluru comes from multiple disciplines, and each of those disciplines has its own standards and its own culture. The geophysicists and the acoustic researchers and the hydrologists and the archaeologists and the geneticists and the geochemists are not naturally in conversation with each other. Their findings accumulate in separate literatures. The researchers who have been tracking the full pattern, who have been following all the threads and recognizing the convergence, are a small group. The broader disciplinary communities whose frameworks would need to shift to accommodate the full pattern are largely unaware of the convergence. Part of the reason is institutional. The questions that the Uluru evidence raises about the deep human past, about ancient connections between Australia and the Americas, about the timeline of human cultural complexity, are questions that institutions with established positions on these matters have some interest in not having reopened. This is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary conservatism of established institutions, which resists significant revision of foundational assumptions even when the evidence for revision is strong. And part of the reason is the peculiar position of Uluru itself, a site whose most significant features are inaccessible because they are protected by the authority of the traditional custodians. A site whose most important body of knowledge is held in a tradition that shares what it shares on its own terms and at its own pace. A site whose significance is so layered and so complex, geological and archaeological and genetic and cultural and acoustic and hydrological, that no single research team with a single set of instruments and a single disciplinary framework can hope to address all of it adequately. The investigation that the evidence demands is interdisciplinary in a way that science rarely actually achieves. It requires the acoustic researchers to know what the geophysicists found. It requires the geneticists to know what the geochemists found. It requires the archaeologists to know what the satellite imaging analysis found. It requires all of them to know what the Anangu tradition says about the specific features they are investigating. And it requires all of this to be integrated in a coherent interpretation that neither a single discipline nor a single research team can produce on its own. This is the organizational challenge. As much as the access challenge and the disciplinary challenge, the organizational challenge is what has kept the full investigation from reaching its potential. The evidence is there, the methods to investigate it further are available or becoming available. The Anangu knowledge exists and in some areas is accessible to researchers with the appropriate relationships. What has been missing is the coordination, the synthesis, the bringing together of the different threads in a form that allows the full pattern to be seen and evaluated. Several researchers who have been tracking the story have been working toward this kind of synthesis for years. The papers they have published in their respective disciplinary journals represent fragments of the pattern. What has been needed is a place and a context and a framework in which all the fragments can be brought together and the full pattern made visible. That work is ongoing, it is slow, it is complicated by the access restrictions and by the disciplinary silos and by the institutional conservatism of the relevant fields. But it is happening. And as it proceeds, the pattern that has been accumulating for 50 years is becoming more visible, more coherent, more difficult to set aside. The investigation of what scientists found beneath Uluru is, in this sense, a story about the process of scientific discovery as much as it is about any specific finding. A story about how knowledge accumulates when a subject is genuinely difficult and genuinely important, how the evidence builds, how the frameworks resist, how the question eventually becomes clear enough and the evidence strong enough that the resistance can no longer hold. We are somewhere in the middle of that process. Not at the beginning, where the anomalies first appeared and were noted without their full significance being recognized. Not at the end, where the underground features have been characterized and the connections have been traced, and the full picture has been integrated into a revised understanding of the deep human past. Somewhere in the middle, where the pattern is visible to those who have been following it, where the evidence is strong enough that it cannot be ignored, but where the definitive answer is still beyond reach. This is an uncomfortable place to be in a story. Stories are supposed to have resolutions, mysteries are supposed to be solved, the investigation is supposed to reach a conclusion, one way or the other, that allows the narrative to close. But the actual investigation does not close. It continues, the pattern accumulates, the question sharpens, the evidence builds, and the resolution, when it comes, will come not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the slow accumulation of enough evidence from enough directions that the framework shift becomes unavoidable. In the meantime, what we have is the pattern, the acoustic resonance marking the same locations as the geophysical anomalies, the ancient water in the deep geological structure, the genetic connections to the Americas, the geochemical markers from South American plants, the geoglyphs with their ancient dates, the satellite mineral anomalies following the lines of the geophysical survey's linear features, the Anangu tradition describing underground features that the instruments keep confirming are there. This is what the investigation has produced. This is what 50 years of research from multiple disciplines converging on the same site from different directions has built. A pattern so consistent and so convergent that it constitutes genuine evidence for something real and significant beneath Uluru. Something that the investigation will eventually characterize completely. Something that will change when it is characterized our understanding of the deep human past and of the ancient connections between this continent and the rest of the world. Something that the Anangu have always known was there, and that the instruments of Western science have been detecting for 50 years. The investigation continues. The rock waits, the pattern strengthens, and the answer, patient as the ancient water in the stone below, waits for the moment when the investigation is ready to receive it. That moment is coming. The evidence says so, the pattern says so, and the rock, older than almost anything else the human eye has rested on, with the intention of understanding, waits. There is a final dimension to this investigation that has not yet been fully addressed, one that connects the physical mystery of what is beneath Uluru to the broader question of what it means for us, the people living now, that such a mystery exists, not in some vague or inspirational sense, but in a specific and practically relevant one. Because the investigation of Uluru is not simply a historical curiosity about what happened in a remote landscape a very long time ago. It is a live question with implications for how we understand ourselves. The deep human past is not inert. It is not a closed chapter with no bearing on the present. The genetic record that connects Australian Aboriginal peoples to South American indigenous populations is a record that is carried by living people. The knowledge system that has maintained an accurate description of the physical features of Uluru for 60,000 years is a living system, practiced by living people, in active dialogue with the landscape it describes. The underground features that the instruments keep detecting are still there, still doing whatever it is that they do, still exhibiting the acoustic and hydrological and geological properties that the surveys have been documenting. The past that the Uluru investigation points toward is not gone. It is present, not in the simple sense that the rock is still standing, in the deeper sense that the patterns established in the deep past are still operating. The water network still holds ancient water. The acoustic resonance still marks the significant locations. The genetic record still carries the traces of ancient connection. The living tradition still transmits knowledge that has proven accurate about physical features that the living landscape still exhibits. This persistence, the fact that patterns established in the deep past are still physically present and detectable, is part of what makes the investigation so significant. We are not trying to reconstruct something that is entirely dissolved into history. We are trying to understand something that is still here, in modified form, still active, still accessible to investigation, if the right kind of investigation is brought to bear. The underground features, if they exist as the evidence suggests, are not relics in the sense of being inert remnants of something long dead. They are features of an active landscape, a landscape that the Anangu have been living in and engaging with for 60,000 years. A landscape that is still doing things, still holding water, and resonating with sound and exhibiting geophysical properties that the standard account does not fully explain. Understanding what the underground features are is therefore not merely an antiquarian exercise. It is an investigation of the present as much as of the past. What is beneath Uluru right now is the same thing that was beneath it 25,000 years ago. In the same stone, in the same dark, accessible in principle, to the same kind of careful attention that the investigation has been bringing to the surface evidence. The investigation of the deep human past at Uluru is an investigation of the present, of what is here now in the landscape and in the living knowledge tradition, and in the physical evidence that the instruments keep detecting, of what it means that this landscape has properties that the standard account does not fully explain, of what it means that a living knowledge tradition and the instruments of Western science keep converging on the same anomalous locations. What scientists found beneath Uluru is, in the end, more than a geological mystery or an archaeological puzzle or a genetic anomaly. It is a reminder that the world is older and more connected and more layered than the standard accounts suggest, that the human past extends deeper than our records reach, and that the traces of that past are still present in the landscape and in the genetic record, and in the living knowledge of the people who have never left the places where their ancestors lived. That the investigation of that past is not finished and may not be finished for a very long time, and that the most important knowledge about it may already exist in the oldest living knowledge tradition on Earth, waiting for the kind of genuine engagement that would allow it to be shared. The rock is there, the knowledge is there, the investigation continues, and what it will eventually reveal, in partnership with the people who have always known, will be one of the most significant contributions to human self-knowledge that the investigation of the deep past has ever produced. The ancient red desert holds its silence. Somewhere below, in the organized dark, in the ancient water, in the resonant stone, the answer waits, patient and complete and unchanged by the 50 years of instruments pointed at its surface, or the 60,000 years of human attention given to its character. What is there will be found. When the partnership is real enough, and the instruments are sensitive enough, and the investigation is ready for what it finds, it will be found. The investigation of what scientists found beneath Uluru is a story without an ending yet, but it is a story with a direction, and the direction is down, into the dark below the red rock, toward what the oldest human knowledge and the newest scientific instruments are both, independently and convergently, saying is there, something ancient, something connected, something true. The rock waits, the investigation continues. There is something that should be said about the nature of this kind of investigation that is often left unsaid. The investigation of Uluru, like all investigations into the deep human past, is not purely a scientific exercise. It is also a human one. It involves people, real people, on both sides of the knowledge divide. Anangu elders who carry the tradition with care and who watch the investigation with a combination of patience and wariness, born of long experience with what outsiders do when they think they have found something valuable. Researchers who have spent years or decades following threads of evidence that their own disciplinary cultures have not fully recognized, who have kept faith with the data when it pointed somewhere uncomfortable, who have tried to build the kinds of relationships that allow genuine collaboration rather than extraction. The investigation of what is beneath Uluru is a story about all of these people, as much as it is about the rock and the chambers and the water and the ancient connections. It is a story about the slow and difficult process of learning to see something in a new way, of having the familiar story that you have always told about a place challenged by evidence that the story does not account for, of sitting with that discomfort long enough for a new story to begin to form. The new story is still forming, it is incomplete, but the outline is clear enough to see. The rock is more than a rock. The past is deeper than the records. The connections are older and more extensive than the standard models accommodate. The knowledge that the Anangu have maintained for 60,000 years is more accurate than the investigators who first arrived at this site gave it credit for being. And what is beneath Uluru is, in the end, the evidence of all of this. The physical traces of a past so deep and a tradition so ancient and a set of connections so far-reaching that it has taken 50 years of careful investigation by multiple independent disciplines, converging from different directions on the same anomalous features, to begin to see the shape of it clearly. The investigation continues, the rock waits, and the world slowly begins to understand what has always been there. The desert night around Uluru has a quality that people who have experienced it describe in similar ways, despite having no prior knowledge of each other's accounts. A quality of completeness, of the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has been here far longer than sound. The rock in the dark is not the same rock as the rock in the daylight. The color is gone, replaced by a deeper sense of mass and presence. The texture that the daytime light reveals is hidden, but something else is revealed in its place. A quality of the place as whole, as entire. As not merely a geological feature sitting in a landscape, but as a feature that is, in some sense, the center of the landscape it sits in. The investigation of Uluru has been circling this quality for 50 years, trying to find its physical basis. The acoustic resonance is part of it. The thermal mass of the rock is part of it. The scale and the darkness and the quality of the air in the desert night are all parts of it, but the parts do not add up to the whole. The whole is more than the sum of its measured parts, and the investigation has not yet found the accounting that would explain why. Perhaps the underground features, when they are finally characterized, will supply the missing element. Perhaps what is in the chambers below will explain why the site has the quality it has. Perhaps the ancient water and the organized stone and the acoustic channels will turn out to be the physical basis of the site's particular power. Or perhaps the underground features will be characterized and the whole will still exceed the measured parts, and the investigation will have to deepen further. Either way, the investigation continues, the evidence builds, the pattern holds, and the rock, patient and complete and ancient beyond any human accounting, waits for the understanding that is coming toward it, one careful measurement and one genuine partnership, and one accumulated decade of research at a time. The answer is there. Beneath Uluru, in the dark, in the water, in the stone, in the knowledge, in the convergence of everything the investigation has been building toward for 50 years. It is there, and the investigation will find it. The rock endures. The investigation continues. The answer waits in the ancient dark below, patient as stone, old as the water, connected to everything. And now, at last, the world is beginning to listen with the right kind of attention. The question remains open, the pattern remains strong, the investigation continues, and the world waits. Because what is beneath Uluru is not just beneath the desert. It is beneath all of our assumptions about how ancient, how connected, and how remarkable the deep human story truly is. It runs deep and it runs old, very old,